Hey there, story lovers. This is Vision Harry, and we're bringing you an epic adventure. Ollivander's ICW report listed 43 illegal bindings on Harry, filed the same day Harry left. Hit like, subscribe, and let's begin this journey. Chapter 1, Gone to market at Jima LFNA smelled like charcoal smoke and cumin and something sweet burning at the edge of it, and Harry Potter hadn't thought about magic in 11 days. That wasn't entirely true. He thought about it the way you think about a limb you've stopped using, with a kind of peripheral awareness, noticing it was there, noticing it had changed, not yet ready to look at it directly. It was like having a river in your chest that used to be a stream. The pressure of it was constant, not painful, just present, and some mornings he woke up at 4 a.m. with his hands glowing faintly gold and no memory of dreaming. He'd rented a room above a leatherworker's shop in the Medina 3 months ago. The landlord, a broad-shouldered man named Yusef, had asked no questions beyond whether Harry planned to cook fish indoors. Harry said no. Yusef said the rent was 400 dirhams a month and that the roof was accessible from the back stairs and that his wife made harira on Fridays that Harry was welcome to if he helped carry water from the courtyard well. Harry had said yes to all of it and that had been the entirety of the arrangement. He liked it here. He liked the noise, the way the square below erupted every evening into something between a carnival and a conversation, the snake charmers and the storytellers and the Nawa musicians and the men selling sheep's heads from lit carts. He liked that nobody looked at his scar. He liked that the magical community here was old and layered and deeply uninterested in British wizarding politics, the way a mountain is uninterested in what the weather is doing in a valley 3 countries away. He sat now at a low table outside a cafe on the edge of the square, drinking mint tea that had been poured from a theatrical height by a boy of about 12, and watching a Moroccan hedge witch 3 tables over do something interesting with smoke and a clay bowl that he was almost certain was a locator charm, but not quite like any he'd seen. She was maybe 70. Her hands moved with the casual economy of someone who'd done the same motion 10,000 times. He watched her without staring, which was a skill he'd picked up in the last 3 months and considered one of his more useful acquisitions. His Arabic was getting better. His Darija, the Moroccan dialect, was still embarrassing, but Yusef's teenage nephew Karim had taken it upon himself to correct Harry every evening in exchange for Harry letting him look at the firebolt, which Harry had brought because it was the only object from his old life he'd been unwilling to leave behind. Karim had never seen a British racing broom before. He approached it with the reverence of someone encountering a religious artifact and the critical assessment of someone who knew what good craftsmanship looked like. Harry had thought, a few times, about whether he should have said goodbye to people. Ron. Hermione. Mrs. Weasley. He'd thought about it and come to the same conclusion each time, which was that goodbye implies a kind of mutual accounting, a chance for the other person to say wait or why or you can't, and he hadn't wanted any of those conversations. Not then. Not with the smell of the battle still in his clothes and Fred Weasley 3 days in the ground and the ministry already sending owls about transitional governance and your role going forward as though he were a resource to be allocated. He'd walked out of the burrow at 5 a.m. with his firebolt, his moleskin pouch, and the clothes he was wearing. He'd taken the night bus to Dover, crossed to Calais on a Muggle ferry that smelled aggressively of diesel and chips, and from there he'd moved south and east by a combination of magical and Muggle transport until he'd ended up here, which had not been a plan so much as a direction. 3 months later, the direction had become a life, and the life felt, for the first time in his memory, like something that belonged to him. He poured more tea and didn't think about Britain. Garrick Ollivander had not slept properly in 31 years. He had not slept well since 1970, when he'd first noticed the anomaly in the wand of a 4-month-old child brought to his shop by a young couple, James Potter, whose wand Ollivander had made himself, and Lily Evans, whose magic was clean and precise and extraordinary. They hadn't brought the child for anything official. Lily had simply wanted to know, the way some parents want to know, this bright, eager woman leaning over the counter while the baby in her arms reached for the mahogany display cases with the unfocused fascination of someone discovering that everything in the world has a shape. Ollivander had let the child's hand brush the edge of an 11-inch Rowan with a unicorn core, a wand he'd made the previous Tuesday and not yet catalogued, and felt the resonance. It had been extraordinary. Clean and vast and multi-layered in a way he'd encountered perhaps twice in 50 years of wand-making. He'd smiled and said nothing and handed Lily Evans a discount card she hadn't asked for. He hadn't seen the binding until the second time, when Albus Dumbledore had brought the child, different circumstances, different year, different everything, and Ollivander had been older and wiser and considerably better at noticing what wasn't there. Something was missing. A layer of resonance that should have been present was simply absent, like a word erased from a sentence that still made grammatical sense but had lost something essential. He'd asked Dumbledore about it, carefully, with the precision of a man who understood that precision was the only armor available to him in certain conversations. Dumbledore had smiled and said it was for the child's protection. Ollivander had not pushed. He had, instead, started keeping notes. He kept them for 17 years. He added to them each time the boy came into the shop, at 11, at 14, at 17, and each time he noted a new binding, carefully documented, cross-referenced against the ICW's restricted codex on magical modification, which he kept in a locked case behind the dried herb bundles. By the time Harry Potter walked into his shop at 11 years old and chose the elder wand's brother, Ollivander had documented 9 bindings. By the time he'd been taken from his shop by Death Eaters, he had 19. In Malfoy Manor, he'd had nothing to do but think. Thinking, in those conditions, was a particular kind of torture, but Ollivander had a mind built for detail and he had used it, cataloguing from memory, working backward through everything he knew about the boy's magic versus what he'd seen of its expression. He'd added 14 more to the mental list. The final 10 he'd identified in the aftermath of the battle, when he'd stood near Harry Potter in the aftermath of whatever had happened in the forest and felt the bindings, one by one, like threads pulled from a tapestry, snap. All 43. In sequence. Like someone dismantling a very carefully constructed prison. He'd filed the report the day Harry left. Not because he expected justice. Ollivander was 82 years old and had been witness to enough institutional behavior to harbor no particular illusions about justice. He'd filed it because it was the only honest thing left to do, and because if he died before it was done, it would have been yet another crime that simply ceased to exist when the last witness forgot it. He sent the report to the ICW's sealed intake office in Geneva, bypassing the British ministry entirely, which was intentional, and then he went home to his shop on Diagon Alley, sat down in his workroom among the wood shavings and the smell of varnish and cores, and finally, after 31 years, slept for 14 hours. Araminta Voss read the report on a Tuesday morning in Geneva, and the first thing she did was make coffee. This was not because she needed a moment to compose herself. She had read worse things over the course of her career, much worse, and she had learned early that composure was not a feeling but a discipline. She made coffee because the report was 93 pages and she was going to read every word of it, and she preferred to read important documents while drinking something hot. She read it in one sitting. The coffee went cold after page 12 and she didn't notice. By page 40 she had pulled out her yellow legal pad, Muggle stationery, a habit she'd acquired from an American colleague 20 years ago and never abandoned because it was faster than dictation quills, and was making notes in her cramped, precise handwriting. By page 70 she had filled 4 pages. By the end she sat very still for approximately 2 minutes, which for Araminta Voss was the equivalent of another person requiring a month of therapy. Then she picked up her quill and wrote the case number at the top of a fresh page. ICW/CR/2198 HJP. Complainant, G. Ollivander. Subject, H. J. Potter, DOB July 31, 1980. Nature, non-consensual magical modification, Category 4 through Category 1. Count, 43. Status, all bindings since dissolved. Perpetrators, multiple, including senior ministry officials, at least one unspeakable, and, per Ollivander's supplementary notes, the late Albus P.W.B. Dumbledore. She underlined the last name. Not for emphasis, the act of underlining helped her think. Albus Dumbledore. She'd met him 3 times. Each time he'd been charming and precise and utterly impossible to pin down, like trying to catch light in a jar. She had never trusted him in the specific way she distrusted people who were always performing wisdom, who had mastered the aesthetic of knowing more than they said. She'd filed that distrust away and gotten on with her work, because her work rarely intersected with British domestic affairs, and Dumbledore had been very careful about keeping British affairs British. He had been, she thought now, looking at page 67 of Ollivander's report, extremely careful about that. The binding architecture Ollivander described was meticulous. Some of it dated to 1980, before the boy could walk, before he could speak, before he could possibly consent to anything, but the most sophisticated work had been done in layers, over years, each binding interlocking with the others in a way that made individual detection nearly impossible. You had to know what you were looking for. You had to be, as Ollivander was, the finest wand maker alive, with 50 years of experience reading magical resonance in wood and core and the hands that shaped them. She turned to the section Ollivander had titled simply Post-Dumbledore Modifications and felt the particular quality of anger she reserved for things that were both unsurprising and still, somehow, monstrous. 12 bindings had been placed after Dumbledore's death. During the war. By persons unknown but, per Ollivander's forensic analysis of the binding signatures, connected to the Department of Mysteries. She wrote a name on her legal pad, considered it, circled it. Barnabas Holt. She had no proof. Not yet. But Holt had been the British ICW representative for 7 years, he had been an unspeakable before that, and his specialty, the reason the Department of Mysteries had recruited him from a brilliant career in Geneva in the first place, had been the study of non-consensual magical modification. She'd have to find the boy first. She pulled out a fresh sheet of parchment and began drafting an international travel waiver for Morocco. Finding Harry Potter was not, as it turned out, difficult for someone who knew how to look. The difficulty was in looking without triggering the kind of alert that would reach London before she did. Araminta had spent 20 years learning to move through the ICW's bureaucratic architecture the way water moves through rock, finding the gaps, the pressure points, the places where the structure was less solid than it appeared. She filed a standard missing persons inquiry under a category that routed to her office automatically without flagging British liaison channels. She cross-referenced international apparition registrations. Harry Potter had not registered any, which told her he'd traveled the Muggle way, or at least the initial leg of it. She contacted 3 informants in the Moroccan magical community through channels that predated the current diplomatic framework and therefore weren't logged anywhere useful. One informant, a very old woman in Essaouira who had once helped Araminta dismantle a contraband trade in cursed artifacts, confirmed that a young British wizard matching Harry's description had passed through her city 2 months ago heading east. Another informant, a younger man in Casablanca, said he'd heard from a colleague in Marrakech about an English boy who flew a racing broom on the roof of a building in the Medina and made the neighborhood children lose their minds with excitement. Araminta booked a port key to Casablanca for Thursday morning. She spent Wednesday reviewing Ollivander's supplementary notes, 40 pages of technical documentation that required, at several points, a working knowledge of wand theory that she was honest enough to admit she didn't fully possess. She contacted the ICW's resident wand scholar, a young Ghanaian which named Ajoa Mensah, and asked her to translate the most technical sections into language suitable for a legal brief. Ajoa read the first 3 pages and went very quiet. "These bindings," she said, in the careful tone of someone choosing words precisely. "Some of them are pre-Victorian. The techniques. They were documented in the 1840s and then, the ICW banned them in 1899 and destroyed all known instructional texts." "All known," Araminta said. "Yes." Ajoa set the pages down. "The person who placed these early bindings, or the people, would have needed access to materials that aren't supposed to exist. And the later ones? Department of Mysteries has a restricted archive. Everyone in the field knows it exists. Nobody's ever gotten access to the catalog." Ajoa paused. "The binding signatures on the post-1997 work are different. More clinical. Less emotional, if that makes sense. The early ones feel almost like love, which is the most disturbing thing I've ever said. But the later ones feel like engineering. Araminta wrote engineering on her legal pad and circled it. "I'll need your analysis in brief form by Monday," she said. "Keep this between us for now." Ajoa nodded and left without asking questions, which was one of the reasons Araminta kept her on staff. Harry was on the roof at sunset when the owl came. He'd been watching the city turn gold, the way Marrakech went from ochre to something almost orange in the last hour of daylight, the minarets catching the last angle of sun while the shadows in the alleys below went blue. Karim had gone home an hour ago. Yusef's wife, Fatima, who had informed Harry in excellent French during his second week that she had decided to treat him like a nephew, which had not been phrased as a question, had left a bowl of something with chickpeas outside his door. The owl was not a species he recognized. Not British. It was a small desert species, tawny and fierce-looking, and it landed on the parapet beside him and extended a leg with the business-like attitude of an owl that had better places to be. The letter had no return address. The seal was ICW blue. Harry looked at it for a moment. Then he opened it. It was brief. 3 sentences. "My name is Araminta Voss. I am a senior investigator with the International Confederation of Wizards. I am coming to Marrakech on Thursday, not to bring you back to Britain, not to discuss your future in any official capacity, but because a man named Ollivander filed a report 3 months ago and I think you should read it before anyone else decides what to do with it." Harry read it twice. Then he set it down on the parapet and looked at the city for a while. His magic moved in his chest the way it had been moving for 3 months, that river pressure, restless, interested. He'd been doing small experiments. Nothing dramatic. He'd fixed the roof drain last week with a flick of his hand and no wand, which had surprised him slightly and sent a pigeon flying off the ledge in alarm. He'd conjured a light in his room the night before and it had been brighter than he'd intended, filling the whole room with something warm and golden, not white, not like Lumos, like something else entirely. Ollivander had filed a report. 43. He didn't know the exact number yet. He only knew that when Voldemort's killing curse had hit him in the forest and he'd come back different, the difference he'd felt wasn't just surviving. Something had broken open. Not him. Something around him. Something that had been fitted onto him, layer by layer, the way you layer clothes onto someone who can't object. He'd thought about it in those terms because thinking about it in the other terms, that specific people had decided specific things about his power and his capacity and his right to be entirely himself, was the kind of thought that could burn a room down if he let it get away from him, and Harry had gotten quite good, in the last 3 months, at not burning rooms down. He picked up the letter again. "I think you should read it before anyone else decides what to do with it." She hadn't said you deserve to know, which anyone might say. She hadn't said we owe you this, which would have been political. She'd said before anyone else decides, and that phrasing, the specificity of it, the implication that someone was already deciding, told him more about Araminta Voss than her name or her title. He turned the letter over and wrote 2 words on the back in his own hand. "I know." He sent the owl back. The ICW office in Geneva was quiet at 9 in the evening, which was when Barnabas Holt preferred to be in the building. He was not a dramatic man. He disliked drama the way a craftsman dislikes unnecessary ornamentation. It obscured the work, added weight without function, distracted from what mattered. He was 61 years old, he had a full head of silver hair he'd stopped noticing in mirrors 20 years ago, and he wore robes that were excellent quality and completely unremarkable, because excellent quality and completely unremarkable was what you wanted if you understood that appearance was just another tool. He sat at his desk on the 4th floor of the ICW building and read the intake notification that had crossed his desk at 6 that evening, flagged by the monitoring protocol he'd established 3 years ago on this exact category of case, and he felt, not alarm, but the particular attentiveness of a man who has been waiting for a specific thing to happen and is now, unhurriedly, beginning to respond. Voss had the report. He'd known Ollivander had filed something. His sources in the British ministry had tracked the wandmaker's movements in the weeks after the battle, and Ollivander had never been subtle about his paper trails. The old man had spent 60 years trusting that documentation was its own kind of protection. In most circumstances, that was correct. In this circumstance it depended entirely on what happened to the documentation. The problem was Voss. Not because he feared her, Holt didn't fear people, he assessed them, and Araminta Voss he had assessed very thoroughly. She was tenacious, she was brilliant, and she had a genuinely irritating tendency to find the one legal mechanism in the entire ICW codex that no one had thought to block. She'd done it in 3 previous investigations and each time it had required significant effort to redirect the outcomes. But she was also working within an institution he largely controlled the architecture of, and institutions were, at their core, made of people who wanted to keep their positions. He opened his desk drawer, removed a piece of parchment, and began writing a note to the ICW's head of internal review. The note was brief, collegial, and entirely damning. I understand investigator Voss has opened an inquiry under case CR/2198. Given the sensitivity of British ICW relations during the current transitional period, I wonder if it might be appropriate for internal review to assess whether the correct protocols were followed in the intake process. Happy to discuss at your convenience. B.H. He sealed it, addressed it, and set it aside for the Morning Post. Then he pulled out a second piece of parchment. The second note took him longer. Not because it was difficult, because it required the particular precision of a man who understood that there were several ways to solve a problem and that the most elegant solution was always the one that appeared, to any outside observer, like not a solution at all. Just a series of natural events. He had known this moment would come since May. He had prepared for it since May. The question had never been if but how, and the answer to how was always the same, carefully, quickly, and with the full institutional weight of a body that had been making decisions about wizarding Britain's interests for 300 years. Harry Potter was powerful. Holt had no illusions about that, he'd commissioned the assessments himself, he knew the numbers, he understood what those 43 bindings had been holding in check and why Dumbledore had started placing them when the child was barely 4 months old. Unbound, Harry Potter was not the most powerful wizard alive in some vague, complementary sense. He was powerful in a specific, measurable way that changed the calculus of every magical conflict on Earth. That wasn't something you left to individual discretion. Holt had done what he'd done because it was necessary. Because some decisions were too important to leave to a 17-year-old boy's personal feelings about them. Because the world needed Harry Potter to be useful, and usefulness required management, and management required, regrettably, sometimes, that the managed party not fully understand the extent of what was being managed. He did not feel guilty about this. Guilt was for people who thought their choices had been optional. He finished the second note, sealed it, and locked both letters in the red-edged drawer he kept for things requiring the kind of care that regular document storage didn't provide. Then he steepled his fingers, looked out the window at the Geneva lights, and thought about Araminta Voss and what she was going to find in Marrakech. Harry woke at 4 a.m, hands glowing. He lay there for a moment in the narrow dark of his room above Yusef's shop, listening to the Medina breathe, the night sounds, cats and distant music and someone 2 streets over hammering something at an hour that suggested either insomnia or professional commitment, and he looked at his hands. The light was gold. Not amber, not yellow, gold, like sunlight through old glass, warm and deep and absolutely nothing like the controlled blue-white of standard lumos. It spread from his palms to his fingers and lit the ceiling with a pattern of moving shadows from the window screen. He didn't try to stop it. That was the new rule he'd made for himself, he didn't try to stop any of it, because stopping things was what had been done to him, and even when it would have been convenient, even when it startled someone or lit up a room he needed dark, he did not clamp down on his own magic. He thought about the letter. About Ollivander. He'd been in the wandmaker's shop at 11, gangly and bewildered, and Ollivander had measured him in silence with the tape that measured by itself and had said curious, very curious when the wand chose him, and Harry had never known what to make of that. He'd gone back at 14, terrified before the first task, and Ollivander had examined his wand with the focused attention of a doctor listening to a heartbeat, and had said everything was in order, and Harry had believed him because Harry had been 14 and had had no particular reason not to. But Ollivander had filed a report. 93 pages. On the day Harry left, he thought about what it would take to write 93 pages about someone. To have kept notes for years, accumulating evidence, watching something happen to a person and documenting it instead of what? What could Ollivander have done? Gone to Dumbledore? Written to the Ministry? The people who had the power to act had been, apparently, the same people doing the acting. He was not angry at Ollivander. He'd have to read the report to know how he felt about Ollivander. He was angry at other things, and the anger was clean and steady, and he had stopped trying to make it smaller. It was proportional. It had been placed in him by specific choices made by specific people, and it was going to remain the correct size until he decided what to do with it. The light in his hands faded slowly. He let it go. Outside, the city began the first call to prayer, the muezzin's voice carrying across the rooftops in the cool pre-dawn air, and Harry closed his eyes and listened to it and thought, Thursday. Fine. Araminta landed in Casablanca at 7 in the morning and took a Muggle taxi to the Medina because she had learned 30 years ago that arriving by Muggle transport was almost always better than arriving by any method that left a magical footprint. She carried one bag. She wore a plain black robe over Muggle traveling clothes and her reading glasses on a chain around her neck and her wand in a holster at her left forearm that she'd had custom made in 1993 and had never needed to replace. She took the train to Marrakech. 4 hours. She read a briefing document on the seatback tray and ate an orange and watched the landscape change from coastal flat to the beginning of something more angular and ochre. She thought about what Ajoa had said. The early ones feel almost like love. She thought about what it meant to bind a child you loved. Whether that was love, actually, or whether love was just the story you told yourself because the alternative, that you'd made a calculated decision about someone else's autonomy before they could walk, was too clinical to live with comfortably. She thought about Dumbledore, who had been brilliant and impossible and, it appeared, capable of things she would have found unforgivable if someone she trusted less had done them. She got off the train in Marrakech at midday and stood in the station for a moment, getting her bearings. A boy of about 16 appeared at her elbow and said, in French, "You're looking for the Englishman." Araminta looked at him. He had an expressive face and was holding a paper bag that smelled of sesame bread. "Am I?" He said, "to bring you." The boy considered. "He said you would know what to do with the information and that you should have coffee first because the walk is hot." Araminta allowed herself a small smile. "Lead on," she said. The boy, who introduced himself as Kareem and offered her a piece of bread from his bag with the casual generosity of someone for whom sharing food was not a gesture but simply the correct behavior, led her through the Medina by a route that had clearly been chosen for shade rather than speed. He asked her, in the course of the walk, where she was from. She said London and Morocco. He nodded as though this made perfect sense. Whether she was here to take Harry back to England, she said no. He looked relieved, and whether she had ever seen a firebolt before, she said once, in evidence, which made him laugh. They came out of an alley into a small courtyard where a man was sitting on a low wall beside a leatherworker's shop, drinking tea, reading what appeared to be a Muggle newspaper, though Araminta noticed he was holding it in the way people hold things when they aren't actually reading them, a prop for appearing occupied rather than for gaining information. Harry Potter looked up when she came into the courtyard. He was taller than she'd expected, though she'd reviewed photographs. He'd let his hair grow slightly past the point of deliberate style into something that suggested simply not caring about it. He was tan from 3 months in the Moroccan sun. He wore Muggle clothes, dark trousers, a plain shirt, boots that had been walked hard. He had a lean, contained quality to him, like someone who had learned to take up only the space they needed, and his eyes, which the photographs had described as green, and they were green, but that description missed something about the quality of them, the attention they carried, moved from Araminta to Kareem to the courtyard entrance and back with the specific awareness of someone who has spent a significant portion of their life needing to know where the exits were. He looked, she thought, like someone who had been freed. Not happy, exactly. Not relaxed. But himself, in a way that the official photographs, the ones taken at the ministry, at Hogwarts, in the immediate aftermath of the battle, had never quite captured. "Was," he said. "Not a question." "Potter," she said. "You got my letter." "You got mine." "I did." She accepted the tea glass Karim pressed into her hand and sat down across from him on a low stool someone had placed there in advance. "You knew I was coming before I sent the letter." "I knew someone was coming," Harry said. The nature of 43 illegal bindings is that, once they're dissolved, you can sort of feel the shape of the cage they made. "I've had 3 months to take inventory." He looked at her steadily. "How bad is the report?" Araminta wrapped both hands around her tea glass and looked back at him. He wasn't performing calm, he was calm. The difference was significant. 93 pages, she said. 43 bindings, the earliest placed when you were 4 months old, the most recent placed in the autumn of 1997, 9 months before the Battle of Hogwarts. She paused. "The early bindings are Dumbledore's work." Harry's expression didn't change. Something behind it did. "And the later ones?" he said. "That's what I need to find out." She pulled the copy of the report from her bag, Ollivander's full 93 pages, sealed with ICW authenticity charms, nothing redacted, and set it on the wall beside him. "I thought you should have the whole picture before I proceed." He looked at the report for a moment. He didn't reach for it yet. "Why?" he said. "Most people in your position would proceed and then inform me. Or not inform me at all." "Most people in my position," Araminta said, "are not currently looking at someone whose entire magical development was shaped by other people's decisions without his knowledge or consent. The absolute minimum I can offer you is the courtesy of asking you to read what was done to you before I start using it as evidence." Something shifted in his face then. Not softness, clarity, maybe. The expression of someone recalibrating. He picked up the report. "Give me an hour," he said. Karim reappeared from nowhere with a fresh pot of tea, set it down with the precise timing of someone who had been briefed, and disappeared again. Araminta sat back in the courtyard shade, took out her legal pad, and let Harry Potter read about his own life for the first time. The afternoon light moved across the stones. From somewhere deep in the Medina came the sound of hammering. A cat appeared on the courtyard wall, assessed both of them, and elected to stay. Harry read for longer than an hour. He read with the focused, still quality of someone for whom reading had always been slightly harder than it should have been. She noted the way he moved through the pages, methodical, going back sometimes, pausing at certain sections for longer than others. She did not watch him overtly. She made notes on her legal pad and drank tea and let him be alone with it, which seemed like the correct thing to give him. When he finally set the report down, he looked out at the courtyard for a while. His hands were still. His face was stone. "Dumbledore placed 11, he said, finally. "Between 1980 and 1981. "Yes." "And someone else placed 12 between 1997 and 1998. "Yes." "Someone with access to Department of Mysteries research that should have been destroyed in 1899. He turned to look at her. His eyes were very steady. "Do you have a name?" "I have a theory," Araminta said carefully. "I need more evidence before it becomes a name I can put on a formal charge." Harry nodded once. He looked back at the report. "The ones Dumbledore placed," he said, and the sentence stopped there for a moment before he continued. "He placed a binding on my parcel tongue. On my ability to communicate nonverbally with magical creatures. On my," he stopped again. When he continued his voice was level but it had a specific, particular flatness to it. "On my ability to form magical bonds. He bound my capacity to anchor to other people. Magically." Araminta said nothing. There was nothing to say to that. "My whole life," Harry said, "I could never," he let out a short breath. "I always wondered why I felt slightly outside of everything. Even when I was in the middle of it. Even with Ron and Hermione. Like there was a pane of glass." He looked at his hands. "That was a binding." 11 of them, Araminta said, quietly. Working in concert. The silence in the courtyard was specific and full. Okay, Harry said, and the word had the weight of someone making a decision. Not about what he felt, he'd already decided that, but about what to do next. He picked up the report again. Tell me what you need from me. Right now. Nothing. I need to go to London. I need to talk to people who were close to you during the war. She met his eyes. One of them may know more than she's told anyone. He understood immediately. His jaw tightened slightly. Hermione. She may not have known the full picture. No, Harry agreed. But she might have known part of it. He stood, folding the report and tucking it under his arm with the manner of a man who had just been given something he was never going to return. She knew things she didn't tell me. I've known that since 5th year. I always thought, he stopped, shook his head. I gave her the benefit of the doubt because she loved me and because I loved her and because that seemed like enough. And now? He looked at her. There was no anger in his face. There was something cleaner and harder than anger. Now I have a report, he said. Go to London. Find out what she knew. And when you have what you need, he paused. Send for me. Not by owl. Araminta nodded and stood. She extended her hand, the formal gesture of a professional agreement, and he shook it with a grip that was sure and unperformed. One more thing, she said. There is at least one very powerful person at the ICW who will try to block this investigation before it gets to a formal hearing. He is going to move quickly once he knows I have this report. Harry looked at her steadily. Let him move, he said. I've been underestimated my entire life. I've stopped finding it inconvenient. Now I find it useful. Araminta picked up her bag and walked out of the courtyard. Behind her she heard the soft sound of Harry Potter pouring himself another glass of tea, calm as the city around him, a young man who had just read 93 pages about everything that had been stolen from him and had not broken, had not raged, had simply said okay and meant it as a battle cry. She thought, this is going to be one hell of a case. Chapter 2, The Shape of the Cage. Harry read the report 4 times. The first time was in the courtyard after Voss left, straight through, every page, the way you read something when you're still deciding whether it's real. The second time was that evening on the roof, slower, with a cup of coffee going cold beside him and the city below doing what it always did at dusk, igniting, filling with noise and light and the smell of food from 100 different fires. The third time was at 2 in the morning because he woke up and couldn't stop thinking about page 47, which described a specific binding on his capacity for wandless magic that had been placed when he was 7 months old, and the clinical precision of Ollivander's language made it worse somehow, not better, like reading a medical report about your own surgery performed without anesthetic. The fourth time he read it with Kareem sitting on the other end of the roof, not reading over his shoulder. Kareem had more tact than most adults Harry had known, just present, kicking his heels against the parapet and eating an orange in sections and occasionally saying things about football that didn't require a response. That time, Harry read with a pencil. He marked things. Not the most obviously monstrous entries, the binding on his connection to magical creatures, the suppression of his capacity to bond with other people magically, the one placed on his wandless ability when he was still small enough to need someone to hold his head up. Those he'd absorbed on the first pass. They sat in him now like stones he'd swallowed, heavy and permanent and his to carry. He marked the technical entries. The ones that required the restricted codex knowledge that had supposedly been destroyed. The ones whose binding signatures Ollivander had described with specific, comparative language, bears structural resemblance to Ministry Unspeakable Research, circa 1978 to 1985, and the ones he'd noted with the careful language of forensic distance. Placement methodology inconsistent with Dumbledore's known technique, suggests secondary practitioner. There had been more than one person working on him. Harry sat with that for a while. He'd known, had known in a vague, unformulated way since waking up in the forest and feeling the world suddenly become larger and louder and more vivid than it had ever been, that the restoration of his magic wasn't simply survival. It was recovery. The way a broken bone, once properly set, aches with the memory of wrong alignment. His magic had been wrong aligned for 20 years and he was only now beginning to understand what correct actually felt like. Wandless magic was the clearest example. It had always been possible, the accidental magic of childhood, the snake at the zoo, the glass that vanished, the inexplicable things that happened when he was frightened or angry. But deliberate wandless magic had always been effortful, slightly out of reach, like a word on the tip of your tongue that keeps sliding away. Even at his best, during training at Hogwarts, it had required significant concentration for relatively small effects. Now it was just, there. Like being able to breathe with both lungs for the first time. He'd been careful with it. Not hiding careful, he'd stopped doing anything for hiding's sake, but learning careful, the way you're careful with a tool you haven't used before and don't yet know the full range of. He fixed things. He moved things. The week before Voss arrived he'd spent an afternoon on the roof conjuring shapes out of thin air, nothing sophisticated, just forms, testing the edges of what came easily versus what required thought. A sphere of light. A small vortex of wind that made Kareem yelp and grab his hat. A shield that deflected a thrown orange, Kareem's, and sent it back with enough force that Kareem caught it only by virtue of excellent reflexes and then looked at his own hands as if they'd done something unexpected. Harry had laughed for the first time in 3 months. The conjured forms came clean and solid and required very little of him. That was the part he was still getting used to, not the power exactly, but the ease of it, the absence of the grinding effort he'd always associated with anything beyond basic spell work. He'd thought for years that he was simply less technically gifted than, say, Hermione, who made everything look surgical and precise. He'd thought his style, blunter, more instinctive, more likely to produce an oversized effect, was a personality flaw made magical. It had been a binding. Multiple bindings, working in concert, shaving off access like pruning a tree trained against a wall. He kept coming back to the one on page 51. Binding 23, suppression of innate magical communication, parseltongue and broader interspecies resonance. Placed August 12, 1980. Placement method consistent with blood anchor technique, requiring either a blood relative or a magically designated guardian. Binding dissolved, May 2, 1998. He'd spoken to snakes twice since then. Once in his first week in Marrakech, at the market, where a man sold cobras in baskets and one of them had turned toward Harry with the specific attention of an animal recognizing something, and Harry had, without thinking, not realizing he was doing it, answered. The conversation had been brief and essentially about the temperature, but it had stopped him in his tracks in the middle of a crowded market with his heart doing something complicated. The second time had been less accidental. He'd found a horned viper on the roof one morning and sat down about 3 feet away from it and said, carefully, in the language that wasn't quite words, "You don't have to leave." The viper had considered him for about 40 seconds with the ancient patience of something that has been solving the problem of survival since before humans existed. Then it had coiled itself more comfortably and stayed for 2 hours. Harry had found this more comforting than he was prepared to explain. He folded the report on the 4th reading and tucked it into the inner pocket of his jacket. He'd made himself a moleskin inner pocket, the pouch Hagrid had given him sewn into the lining, because he was never going to be comfortable with important documents in standard storage again. "You look like someone making a plan," Kareem said from the other end of the roof. Plans are good. My uncle says plans are just wishes that know what they're doing. Harry considered this. Your uncle is unexpectedly wise. He also says the same thing about bread dough, so I'm not sure how seriously to take it. Kareem peeled another section of orange. Are you going to go back to England? Eventually. Not yet. Not yet. Kareem nodded as though this made complete sense. Fatima will be upset. She's decided you need feeding up. I'm fine. Yes, but she's decided, Kareem said, with the philosophical tone of someone who had long since made peace with a force of nature. It's not really about you at that point. Harry smiled. He looked out over the rooftops and thought about the report in his pocket and about Araminta Voss on a train to London and about Hermione, who had known things she hadn't told him, and about the fact that for the first time in his life, none of this felt like something happening to him. He was going to do something with it. He didn't know exactly what yet. But the shape of it was forming, clean and deliberate, like one of the conjured spheres, starting as potential and becoming solid. Araminta was on the Hogwarts Express. Not the student train, the line didn't run in summer. She was on the standard magical rail service from Edinburgh that ran twice weekly, because the fastest way from Geneva to London via Muggle Air had deposited her in Edinburgh instead of Heathrow due to a scheduling conflict she hadn't been bothered to resolve, and the train gave her 4 hours to prepare. She was preparing by reading a file on Hermione Jean Granger. Age 19. Brightest student of her generation at Hogwarts, the file cited Minerva McGonagall's assessment from 1997, which used phrases like exceptional analytical mind and surpasses almost all her instructors in theoretical framework with the grudging understatement of someone paying a genuine compliment while fighting the urge to overstate. Top marks in every subject she'd taken. Had been awarded an Order of Merlin, 2nd class, for her role in the defeat of Voldemort. Currently living in her parents' flat in Hampstead while she completed the process of reversing the memory charm she'd placed on them during the war. Araminta had read about the memory charm in a supplementary brief. Hermione Granger had erased her parents' memories of herself, given them new identities, and sent them to Australia, a piece of preemptive protection that was by any technical standard an illegal modification of 2 Muggle minds, undertaken without consent, however understandable the reasoning. Araminta was not interested in prosecuting it. She was interested in what it told her about Hermione Granger's relationship to the idea that certain necessary protections justified certain compromises of individual autonomy. She closed the file and watched the Scottish countryside unreal outside the window and thought about the conversation she was going to have. She had done this kind of interview many times. The kind where you were talking to someone who had both loved someone and failed them, and who knew it, and who was in the particular defensive posture of someone who had been repeating their own justifications to themselves for long enough that the justifications had started to sound like facts. It was delicate work. Push too hard and you got anger that shut everything down. Not hard enough and you got the managed version, the story as the person had told it to themselves, smooth and self-protective and missing all the edges. The trick was to let them talk. People who were carrying guilt talked. They couldn't help it. And eventually, if you were patient and quiet and you didn't signal judgment at the crucial moment, they said the thing they'd been not saying, and that was where the real information lived. She arrived at King's Cross at 2 in the afternoon and took the tube to Hampstead, which was the kind of small detail that she bothered with because she had learned, over 30 years, that small details accumulated into a picture of the sort of person you were, and she liked the kind of person she was. Hermione opened the door with flour on her hands and a look of someone who had been expecting a different visitor. She was small and compact and had the focused energy of a person who filled rooms more thoroughly than their physical presence suggested, the kind of person who, in school, would have been in the front row with their hand up and genuinely meant it rather than performing effort. Her hair was longer than the file photos from the battle. She'd obviously been baking, which Araminta found slightly surprising and then adjusted her surprise. Stress baking was a remarkably common response in extremely intelligent people, who needed something to do with their hands that their minds could run alongside rather than focus on. Ms. Granger, Araminta said. I'm Araminta Voss, ICW senior investigator. I sent an owl yesterday. You did, Hermione said. Her eyes went to Araminta's ICW identification badge in the quick, cataloging way of someone who checked credentials not out of doubt but out of habit. Come in. I'm sorry about, she looked at her hands. I was making bread. Don't apologize. Carry on, if you like. I can talk to someone who's doing something else. This was calculated. People were marginally less guarded with their hands occupied. Hermione appeared to recognize this on some level because her expression sharpened slightly, a flicker of you know what you're doing, and then she stepped back and let Araminta in. The flat was small and crowded with books in the way that looked organic rather than decorative, books that had been read and reread and were currently being read, stacked in the configurations of active use rather than display. Her parents had not moved back yet. There was a guest bedroom that looked ready but unused, a kind of anticipatory neatness in the spare spaces. The living room had a sofa with a throw blanket and a legal pad on the coffee table with handwriting that stopped mid-sentence, which said something about the state Hermione had been in when the owl arrived. Araminta sat in the armchair. Hermione went back to the kitchen and resumed kneading bread dough, which meant Araminta could see her hands and her hands could be read. "This is about Harry," Hermione said. "Not a question." "Garrick Ollivander filed a report with the ICW 3 months ago," Araminta said. 93 pages. "He documented 43 illegal magical bindings placed on Harry Potter between 1980 and 1998. The bread dough got a significant amount of force applied to it." 43, Hermione said. Her voice was level. Impressively level. "The earliest were placed by Albus Dumbledore, beginning when Harry was 4 months old." Araminta watched Hermione's hands. "The latest were placed by an as yet unidentified practitioner in the autumn of 1997, 9 months before the battle." Hermione was very quiet for a moment. She kept working the dough. Then she said, "How many of the 43 did Dumbledore place?" 11. Another silence. Araminta let it breathe. "And the rest?" Hermione asked. 20 are attributed to Dumbledore by method, if not entirely by direct placement, meaning the binding techniques are consistent with his practice. Some may have been placed by operatives following his design. The final 12 appear to have originated in the Department of Mysteries." Hermione stopped kneading. She stood very still with her back to Araminta, her hands pressed flat on the counter, and Araminta could see the breath she took, slow, deliberate, the breath of someone who has just had something they half suspected confirmed in the worst possible terms. "I knew about 4, Hermione said. There it was. Araminta said nothing. "I knew about 4, Hermione said again, and turned around, and her face was doing something complicated and painful and honest. "Dumbledore told me, not directly, not at first. He told me in the context of Harry's training. He said that Harry had certain magical parameters that had been put in place for his protection and that part of my role was to," she stopped. Her jaw tightened. "He said part of my role was to help maintain those parameters. To not encourage certain kinds of, to discourage Harry from exploring certain areas of wandless magic. To redirect." The word redirect landed in the room with the weight of something that had been carried for a long time. "You were 17, Araminta said." "Yes." Hermione's voice was sharp. Not defensive, preemptively sharp, the anger of someone who knows the defense they're about to make and despises themselves for needing it. "I was 17, and Dumbledore was Dumbledore, and he told me it was for Harry's protection. He told me Harry's power needed to develop slowly or it could," she pressed her lips together. "He said it could destroy him. If it came in too fast. He said the bindings were a controlled release. He said they were kind. And you believed him." "I believed him," Hermione said, and the 3 words had the specific quality of a confession that has been waiting too long to be spoken. "I believed him and I spent 5 years, being careful. Being the person who redirected. Who encouraged certain paths and not others. Who," she looked at her hands. "Who told Harry he probably couldn't do wandless complex spells yet because he hadn't mastered the theory. When the truth was, that the bindings were preventing it regardless." "Yes." The silence was different now. Less defended. Araminta said, "You were asked to participate in something by an authority figure you trusted. You didn't know the full scope. You acted in good faith." "Don't," Hermione said flatly. "Please don't. I know what the legal framework would say and I don't want the legal framework right now. I need to say this." She set down the towel she'd been gripping. "I knew something was wrong. I knew it the year of the Triwizard Tournament. Harry's magic in crisis situations was, the ceiling of it was so much higher than anything he could manage deliberately, and I noticed it and I told myself it was adrenaline. I told myself it was consistent with an underdeveloped theoretical base. I told myself a lot of things. She looked at Araminta. And I never asked Dumbledore the right question. What was the right question? Does Harry know? The kitchen was very quiet. Does he know about the 4 you were aware of? Araminta asked. I don't know. We haven't spoken since he left. Hermione said it the way you say something you've been trying not to feel. He left without, there was no note, no owl, nothing. I understood why. I didn't blame him. I kept expecting to hear something, but, she shook her head. He's all right. He's read the full report, Araminta said. He's in Marrakech. He's considerably more than all right. Hermione closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them they were wet at the edges and she was clearly furious with herself about it. Right. Good. That's good. I need to ask you about the 12 post-1997 bindings, Araminta said. In the autumn of 1997, Harry was at your parents' home, then at Grimmauld Place, then actively hunted. Do you recall anything unusual during that period? Anyone with unusual access to him? Any incidents where he was unconscious or otherwise incapacitated? Hermione's expression sharpened immediately, the grief folded back and the analyst came forward, which was clearly more comfortable territory and also, Araminta thought, completely genuine, both things being true at once. There were 3 periods of incapacitation during the hunt, she said, moving back to the counter with the automatic precision of someone accessing a filing system. The incident at Godric's Hollow, he was stunned by Nagini and we both operate without full control, he had a concussion and was unconscious for roughly 6 hours. The ambush at Tottenham Court Road, he took a partial memory charm, not a full one, he recovered in about 4 hours. And the Snatchers, he was stunned, we all were, and we were taken to Malfoy Manor. Malfoy Manor, Araminta said. Yes. Hermione's voice changed slightly. Ollivander was there. Harry was taken separately. I don't know what happened to him in the time he was separated from us. We assumed, it was Death Eaters. Was Harry's condition noticeably different afterward? Hermione was very still for a long moment. He was more controlled, she said slowly. Afterward. I noticed it. We were fighting for our lives, we were at Shell Cottage by then, and his magic was, I thought he was conserving. Being strategic. But he was, she stopped. Looked at Araminta. He was less. His response times were slower. The scale of his castings were smaller. I thought it was, she pressed the heel of her hand to her forehead. I thought it was psychological. Trauma response. It may have been both, Araminta said. But the binding record shows the last placement was made in October 1997. Shell Cottage was late February 1998. Between Godric's Hollow and the Manor, Hermione said, half to herself. She was thinking hard. Araminta could almost hear it. The Tottenham Court Road ambush, we were out cold for 4 hours. We were in a Muggle cafe, but anyone with a disillusionment charm and the right, she looked up. Someone was following us. That's my working theory, Araminta said. Someone followed us during the hunt and used the windows when Harry was unconscious to, she couldn't finish that sentence. She stood in her kitchen with flour on her hands and a face that was doing the thing faces do when a person is revising their entire understanding of a period they thought they understood. For the whole time. Someone was tracking him. Not to catch him. To maintain a level of magical suppression that made him useful but manageable, Araminta said. Yes. The word manageable hit Hermione the way it hit everyone who heard it in that context, with the specific visceral quality of a thing that was technically neutral and actually obscene. Who? Hermione said. That's what I'm finding out. Araminta stood and retrieved her bag. "Thank you, Ms. Granger. This was more useful than you know." "Wait." Hermione took a step forward. "I want to help. With the investigation. I have knowledge of the technical side, I can cross-reference Ollivander's binding descriptions with, I was there for most of it. I can." She stopped and made herself slow down. When she continued her voice was quieter. "I owe Harry this. Whatever it's worth." Araminta looked at her for a long moment. "If I need expert consultation on the technical record," she said, "I'll send for you. And if you need a witness? Then I'll do more than send for you." She picked up her bag. "One more thing. You said Dumbledore told you about 4 bindings. When exactly was that conversation?" Hermione thought. "August 1996. The summer before 6th year. He came to my parents' house." She frowned. It was after my OWL results. He was congratulating me on my marks. He made it sound almost incidental. He said, "There's something I should tell you about Harry's development, because you're the person best placed to support it properly." "And he told you what those 4 bindings were?" "He described them as, he didn't use the word binding. He used parameters. He said Harry had magical parameters placed for his safety." "Did he tell you who placed them?" A pause. "He said he had. In consultation with people who understood the stakes." Araminta filed that away, thanked Hermione again, and let herself out. In the street outside, she stood for a moment in the Hampstead afternoon, the particular golden quality of London's summer light that she'd grown up with before Geneva had become home, and wrote on her legal pad, Malfoy Manor, October 1997. Binding 35 to 43 placed during extraction/captivity window. Not Death Eaters, too precise. Requires access to restricted binding techniques. Holt was called back from Geneva to the Dom in September 1997. She underlined the last line. Then she underlined it again. Barnabas Holt received the internal review response on Wednesday morning, and it was, as he'd expected, entirely cooperative. The head of internal review was a Swedish wizard named Arvid Sund, who had held the position for 11 years and who understood, with the political acuity of a career administrator, that internal review existed to provide institutional ballast, to slow things down, to ask procedural questions, to create the kind of paper trail that allowed, at a later date, for any given outcome to be framed as process compliant. He was not corrupt in the transactional sense. He was corrupt in the more durable sense of a man who valued institutional stability more than institutional honesty and had learned to tell himself these were the same thing. Holt wrote back, thanked him, and requested that a preliminary procedural review of Voss's intake process be completed by Friday. He then turned to the more interesting problem, which was Harry Potter himself. Holt had spent 3 months since the battle reassessing. He was not a man who avoided reassessment, it was one of the qualities he privately considered his best, the willingness to update his model when new information required it. He'd modeled Harry Potter for years, and for years the model had been, powerful but suppressed, unpredictable under extreme pressure, fundamentally reactive rather than strategic. The bindings had ensured that. A reactive, sufficiently powerful, sufficiently motivated young man was a good weapon. An unrestricted, fully capable version of the same young man, who now knew he'd been managed and was clearly not in a reactive state about it, that was something else. He pulled the dossier he'd compiled on Harry's movements since May. Thin but legible, Morocco, the Marrakech Medina, a neighborhood that suggested preference for anonymity in close quarters, Muggle-adjacent living. Multiple reports from the Moroccan magical community of low-level wandless magic, nothing dramatic, nothing aggressive, consistent with someone learning a new range of motion. Someone learning. Holt had expected either collapse or explosion. Neither had happened. The boy was practicing. Systematically, by the sound of it. He stood at his office window looking at Lake Geneva in the afternoon light and thought about what it meant when someone you had spent years engineering as a weapon decided to pick up the weapon himself and learn its actual dimensions. He would have to move faster. There were two levers available. The first was the ICW procedural challenge through Sund, that would bog Voss down for weeks, possibly months, and might result in the case being reassigned to someone more manageable. The second was more direct, the British ministry's position. If the ministry filed a formal claim of sovereignty over the investigation, arguing that the bindings, whatever their nature, were domestic matters under British jurisdiction, the ICW would be constitutionally required to defer. He needed the Minister for Magic on board. The current minister was 3 months into the job, overwhelmed, politically obligated to approximately everyone who'd supported his candidacy, and desperately interested in projecting stability. Holt had worked with the man before. He understood the pressure points. He wrote 3 letters. He sent them by 3 different owls. Then he sat back in his chair and thought about the variable he couldn't fully predict. Harry Potter had read the report. He was not reacting the way a damaged person reacts. He was not going to hide, or collapse, or come to the ICW begging for institutional protection like a man who needed the system to help him. He was in Marrakech, learning the dimensions of his own power, and when he decided to move, it wasn't going to be in a direction that Holt had engineered. That was, Holt admitted to himself with the clinical honesty he applied to everything, a problem. Harry wrote a letter on Thursday. He sat at the low table in his room with the door open to the courtyard, the afternoon heat pressing in from the tiles, and wrote on plain paper with a Muggle pen because he'd been using Muggle pens since March and found them considerably more honest than quills, which had always felt slightly performative to him. Dear Ollivander, I've read your report. All of it, 4 times. I'm not going to tell you it wasn't difficult to read, because it was, but I want to say clearly that I understand why you filed it and I think you were right to. I want to ask you something. In the supplementary notes, page 78, the section on binding resonance analysis, you write that the techniques used in the early bindings required access to materials that were officially destroyed in 1899. You say the signature of the craftwork is consistent with materials from a private collection. I'd like to know whose collection. I'm not asking you to put yourself at risk. I'm asking because there is an ICW investigation underway and I think the information would be useful to the person running it, and I think you already know the answer and have been careful not to include it in the report because you wanted to give it directly. You've been careful my entire life. I appreciate the accuracy of the documentation. I want you to know that. Harry he folded the letter, addressed it to the shop on Diagon Alley, and sent it with a minister registration-free magical courier, a Moroccan magical postal service that operated through a relay of trained desert birds and had been running since the 14th century, which meant it predated British magical postal regulation by about 300 years and therefore wasn't subject to it. Then he went out to the market. He bought bread from the same stall he always bought from, a woman named Aisha who had decided at some point that Harry was a steady customer who deserved the good stuff from the back, the bread that was still warm, and coffee from the cafe where the elderly hedge witch sometimes sat in the mornings, and he walked the length of the souk and let himself be part of the noise and the color and the absolute magnificent indifference of 10,000 people going about their lives. His magic moved in his chest and he let it. He passed a stall selling glass lanterns and felt the light in them respond slightly, warming by half a degree, which made him smile. He stopped at the stall with the snakes. The cobra in the basket nearest to him turned its flat head toward him immediately. The man selling them watched Harry with mild commercial interest. Temperature better today, Harry said, in the language that wasn't words. Adequate, the cobra said, in the way of something that made no compromises. There are things I need to do, Harry told it, for no real reason except that the conversation felt clarifying. I'm trying to decide the order. The cobra regarded him. Order matters less than movement. Fair point. He bought a small painted box from the stall next door, not for any reason, just because it was a good color, and walked back toward Yusef's courtyard. The evening call to prayer was starting from the nearest minaret, layering with the distant echo of another one, a conversation between 2 points of the city. He thought about 43. He thought about what 43 things, layered and interlocked, could do to a person over 20 years. Not in a self-pitying way, he'd already moved past the version of this that was about pain, into the version that was about understanding. He thought about what he had been capable of despite 43 suppressions, and what that said about what he was capable of without them, and he thought about the person or persons who had looked at that calculation and decided the answer was frightening enough to require management. He thought about the word Hermione had apparently used, according to Voss's brief update that had arrived that morning, manageable. He ran the word through his mind a few times. Turned it over. He was the least manageable person he knew. He'd always been told this was a flaw. He was beginning to understand it was the opposite. Fatima was in the courtyard when he came back, negotiating aggressively with a fabric seller over the quality of something blue, and she interrupted herself long enough to point at him and say, in French, "You're too thin, I made soup, it's on the stove." "Thank you," Harry said. "Don't thank me, eat it." She returned to the negotiation. Harry went upstairs, ate the soup, which was extraordinary, saffron and lamb and something he couldn't identify that was probably the best thing he'd eaten all week, and sat by his window watching the rooftops go dark. He thought about the private collection. About page 78. About the name that Ollivander had not included and that Harry was almost certain he knew, because there was only one person in Wizarding Britain who collected everything, who kept what other people discarded or destroyed, who had a library that predated the ICW itself. He thought about what came next. He thought about how, for the first time in his life, he had the luxury of choosing. Not reacting. Not responding. Not being pointed at a problem and deployed. Choosing. The way you choose when you understand your own capabilities and have the time and freedom to think about what they're actually for. Voss would send for him when she was ready. He'd be ready before she sent. He pulled out the report, page 78 specifically, and read it again by the light from his palm, gold and warm and finally, fully, his. Chapter 3. What Hermione knew. The owl arrived at Hermione's flat on a Friday morning while she was on the phone with a solicitor in Sydney about her parents' property documentation, which was the kind of task that required approximately 40% of her attention and left 60% free to feel terrible about everything else. She finished the call, looked at the letter, and recognized Harry's handwriting immediately, the slightly cramped, leftward-leaning print of someone who'd been told his penmanship needed work at some point and had subsequently decided not to care about penmanship. She sat down before she opened it. Hermione. Voss told me about your conversation. Not everything, she's not that kind of investigator, but enough. I know you knew about 4 of them. I'm not writing to make you feel worse. I imagine you're already doing that thoroughly on your own. I'm writing because there's something I need to know and you're the only person I trust to answer it honestly, which is still true, by the way. The 4 things you knew about, how much did knowing them change how you acted around me? Be specific. I need the timeline. I'm not angry at you. That's not a diplomatic thing to say. I'm genuinely not. I'm angry at the people who put you in that position, which is different. Write back. Don't be careful about it. Hermione read it 3 times. Then she went to the kitchen, made tea she didn't drink, came back, and picked up her own pen. She wrote for 2 hours. Not a careful letter, Harry had specifically said not careful, and she honored that because it was the only honest thing she could do. She wrote the timeline. August 1996, Dumbledore's visit. The specific language he'd used, parameters, Harry's safety, controlled development. The things she'd done differently afterward, the subtle redirections in study sessions, the times she'd let his frustration with wandless magic go uncommented when she'd normally have dug into the theory with him, the years she'd deliberately not mentioned a paper she'd read on magical resonance that would have given him exactly the language he needed to start asking the right questions. She wrote, I told myself I was protecting you. That's what I believed. But when I write it out like this, what I was actually doing was deciding that my assessment of the risk to you was more important than your right to know about yourself. And I learned that from Dumbledore, and I never questioned it, and that is the part one am least able to forgive myself for, not the actions themselves but the fact that I was so certain I was right that it never occurred to me to check. She wrote, the timeline of the redirections is as follows. She wrote 4 pages. She sealed it and sent it before she could revise it, because revision was her particular form of avoidance and she knew it. Then she sat in her living room and cried for about 20 minutes with the focused efficiency of someone who was going to do this once, properly, and then get on with things. Araminta had been in London for 4 days and she'd spent all of them in the ministry. Not in the official capacity, she hadn't announced herself to the minister or gone through the formal liaison channels, because those channels ran, at several key junctions, through Barnabas Holt's network, and she wasn't interested in announcing her research agenda to the person she was researching. She'd spent the time in the public record offices, the historical registry, the administrative archive that the British ministry maintained with the aggressive disorganization of an institution that had been adding paper to a pile for 300 years without ever developing a coherent system. She was looking for the private collection. Ollivander's page 78 had been careful, deliberate, and specific in its non-specificity, the kind of omission that was itself a pointing finger, if you knew how to read it. She'd sent a response to his letter through the same Moroccan courier Harry had used, thanking him for the report and asking, with equal care, whether he might be available for a conversation about the supplementary notes. He'd written back the same day. Diagon Alley. Tuesday, after 5. Come to the shop, not the flat. It was currently Monday. She had 1 day. She was in the Department of Magical Records on level 6, in a reading room that smelled of must and old parchment, working through procurement records for the Department of Mysteries from 1994 to 1998. It was tedious work. The DOM kept their procurement deliberately opaque, separate budget lines, vague category descriptions, everything labeled with the particular bureaucratic language designed to be technically accurate while being practically meaningless. She was on her 3rd box when she found it. A single-line item. November 1996. Consultancy Services, Restricted Research Assistance, External Specialist, BH. Rate, Classified. Duration, Ongoing. BH November 1996 was 2 months after Dumbledore's visit to Hermione's parents. 3 months after Harry's 5th year ended. 6 months into Harry's 6th year. She photographed the page with a small Muggle camera she kept in her bag and kept going. 2 boxes later she found another one. September 1997. Restricted Archive Access, Temporary Waiver, BH Material Category, Pre-1900 Binding Research. Duration, 14 days. 14 days. That was the window before the hunt began in earnest. She took careful notes, repacked the boxes in precisely the order she'd found them, an investigative habit so ingrained it was automatic, and left the ministry by the visitor's entrance on the embankment, walking out into the London evening with the specific satisfaction of someone who has found the thread and needs only to pull it. She was also being followed. She'd noticed on day 2, a young man in a grey ministry robe who appeared at 2 separate archive rooms on different floors within an hour of each other. Too young for a senior operative, too consistent in his positioning for coincidence. Someone's watcher. She'd done nothing about it. Let him watch. She was, as far as anyone observing her could tell, simply a visiting ICW investigator doing routine archival work. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would indicate she'd found what she'd found. She stopped at a Muggle newsagent on the embankment and bought a coffee and a newspaper and sat on a bench facing the river, and 3 minutes later the young man in the grey robe materialized on a bench 30 feet away with a newspaper of his own, which he was holding upside down. Araminta sipped her coffee. She thought about Barnabas Holt, who was smart enough to have someone watching her but had chosen someone too inexperienced to do it properly, which was interesting. Either he was running low on reliable assets, possible, if his British network had been disrupted by the post-war reshuffle, or he had made the mistake of underestimating her, which would be his first serious error and therefore useful. She finished her coffee and walked back to her hotel, noting the route her watcher took when she crossed a side street and he had to make a quick decision about positioning. He chose wrong. He was definitely young. She thought, Holt is being cautious but not quite cautious enough. Good. Hermione had spent the weekend doing something she hadn't done in months, which was actual research. Not for school, there was no school, her newts were deferred and she hadn't yet decided what came after them. Not for the war, which was over. For Harry. Specifically for the technical section of Ollivander's report, which Araminta Voss had sent her a copy of with a note that said simply, "You said you could help with the technical record, here it is. I need a plain language translation of bindings 12 through 31 for a legal brief. By Friday if possible." Hermione had said by Wednesday. She'd cleared her kitchen table, spread out 3 texts on magical theory, 2 on historical binding practice, and 1 on wand resonance that she'd had to request from the British Library's magical annex, and she'd worked. Properly worked, the way she used to work, not anxiously, not with the grinding self-pressure of exam preparation, but with the clean, focused pleasure of someone who was genuinely good at something and had a real reason to use it. Bindings 12 through 31 covered the period from Harry's 2nd year through his 5th. Ollivander's documentation was brilliant, forensically precise, technically meticulous, but it was wandmaker's language, full of resonance terminology and core signature vocabulary that required translation for anyone without his specific expertise. Binding 14, for example, suppression of advanced nonverbal spell work, category 2 through 4. Placed June 1992. Maintains functional verbal casting while restricting parallel magical processing. Effect, subject unable to sustain more than 2 simultaneous active enchantments without severe drain. Hermione stared at that one for a long time. June 1992 was the end of Harry's 2nd year. 2nd year was the Chamber of Secrets. Which meant someone had placed this binding after Harry destroyed a basilisk at age 12 with nothing but a sword and sheer determined will, and the binding had then been in place for the rest of his Hogwarts years, and through the war. She wrote her translation. This binding prevented Harry from holding multiple active spells at once without rapidly depleting his magical reserves. In combat terms, this would limit him to sequential rather than simultaneous defensive and offensive magic, a significant tactical disadvantage. It would have been imperceptible without specialist diagnostic examination, as it didn't prevent spell work, only constrained the ceiling of its simultaneous scope. She moved to binding 17. Reduction of innate shield generation, partial. Placed September 1994. Binding signature consistent with practitioner with unspeakable level training. Effect, reduction of instinctive magical defense response by estimated 40 to 60%. September 1994 was the month Harry started his 4th year. The Triwizard Tournament. Hermione sat back and looked at the ceiling. Someone had reduced Harry's instinctive magical defenses right before sending him into a tournament designed to kill adult wizards. She didn't throw anything. She wanted to. She made herself be still for about 30 seconds and then she kept writing, because the translation was what Voss needed and the work was the useful thing, and being useful was the only thing she currently had that felt like it was going anywhere. By Wednesday morning she had a 20-page brief. It was clear, precise, and, in several places, devastating. She sent it to Voss and then sat at her cleared kitchen table and thought about Harry reading this over and over in Marrakech, in a room she'd never seen, and she thought about the pane of glass he described in his letter to her. I always felt slightly outside of everything, like there was a pane of glass, and she thought about all the times she'd seen that look on his face and told herself it was introversion, or his upbringing, or just the weight of being Harry Potter. She had known something was wrong. She had chosen to know less. She picked up her pen and wrote him another letter. This one shorter. I finished the brief. I'm going to Diagon Alley tomorrow with Voss. She's meeting Ollivander and wants me there for the technical side. I need to ask you something and I'm going to ask it directly because you told me not to be careful. Did any of it feel like me? The redirections, the times I didn't tell you things. Did it feel like I was doing something to you? You don't have to answer. But I need to know if you knew. She sent it before she could think about whether she wanted the answer. Ollivander's shop was as it had always been, narrow and dim and smelling of wood shavings and the faint dusty warmth of stored cores, but there was something different about it now, a quality of restoration. The sign was newly painted. The boxes on the shelves were rearranged, which might have looked like disorder but was in fact a new order, a different system from the one he'd maintained before. He'd restarted his work. There was a half-finished wand on his workbench, visible through the back doorway. He was making something new. He met them at the door, Araminta and Hermione arriving together, which had required exactly one awkward 5-minute conversation outside on Diagon Alley that had consisted largely of them sizing each other up and deciding simultaneously that they were both primarily interested in getting on with it. He was thin, Ollivander, thinner than Hermione remembered, with the particular fragility of someone who had been through something physical and was rebuilding. But his eyes were exactly as they had always been, pale, fixed, the eyes of someone who saw more than was being shown. "Miss Granger," he said. "You've grown. Not in height." "I've had a strange year," Hermione said. "Haven't we all?" He looked at Araminta. "Ms. Voss. Your reputation precedes you. Tea." "Please," Araminta said. He led them through to the back workroom, which was warmer than the shop proper, and made tea with the specific precision of someone for whom all craft was equally worthy of care. Hermione looked at the half-finished wand on the bench, hornbeam, she thought, with something she didn't recognize as a core container. "Page 78, Araminta said, when the tea was poured and they were seated on the collection of mismatched chairs that seemed to constitute Ollivander's furniture policy. "Yes," he said. He didn't pretend not to understand. "The private collection. You named a collection without naming its owner." "I named it carefully," he said. "Because naming it incorrectly in a public document would have given the owner grounds to challenge the document's validity, and the document needed to stand." He wrapped both hands around his tea mug. "The collection belongs to the Black family. The historical library at Grimmauld Place, specifically. It contains materials acquired by Phineas Nigellus Black in the mid-1800s and never catalogued, officially or otherwise. It includes texts on pre-ICW binding practice that were supposed to have been surrendered to the Confederation in 1899. Hermione made a sharp sound. "Grimmauld Place. That's Harry's house," Araminta said. "Harry's house," Ollivander confirmed. "Which was also Dumbledore's resource pool for 17 years. Dumbledore had access to that library. He used it." He paused. "I'm not telling you he was malicious. I want to be precise about this, because precision matters and I have been thinking about it for 31 years. Dumbledore used those texts and he believed he was doing what had to be done. He was wrong. But I think he genuinely believed the bindings were protection." 11 bindings, Hermione said, with a flatness in her voice. "The first 6 were placed when Harry was between 4 months and 18 months old," Ollivander said. "I believe Dumbledore's intent was to prevent Harry from drawing attention to himself through accidental magic. The child had extraordinary innate power, extraordinary, Miss Granger, I don't use the word loosely. The level of accidental magic at that age would have been, noticeable. Dangerous. In that context I can reconstruct the logic." "And the rest?" Araminta said. "The rest became a habit." Ollivander's voice was quiet and very precise. "That is the thing about protective intervention. It is difficult to stop because every step you've taken requires the next step to maintain the structure of the previous ones. Dumbledore built a system and then he maintained the system, and each maintenance reinforced the original justification." He looked at his hands. By the time Harry was 5 years old, Dumbledore had made himself architecturally necessary to Harry's magical stability. Removing the bindings would have required work he didn't do. He intended to do it. I believe that. He simply ran out of time to complete the unraveling. "And the Department of Mysteries bindings?" Araminta said. "Bindings 32 through 43. Ollivander was quiet for a moment. Those are different in character. I want to be exact. Dumbledore's bindings have a quality to them, even the restrictive ones, of someone who was also, simultaneously, trying to preserve something. He wasn't only suppressing. He was attempting to shape. His work is almost architectural. Some of it is quite beautiful, technically. He looked at Araminta. The later bindings have none of that quality. They are purely functional. They solve a specific problem, which is, how do you maintain a specific ceiling on a person's magical output without the person noticing the ceiling? Engineering, Hermione said, quietly. Yes. The engineering is sophisticated but cold. Whoever placed them understood the earlier work. They had access to Dumbledore's binding record, which I can tell from the way they threaded the new bindings through the existing architecture rather than placing them independently. They knew what was there. They used it. His pale eyes moved between the two of them. They built on Dumbledore's foundation and they did it without any of Dumbledore's ambivalence. The workroom was quiet. The sound of Diagon Alley moved faintly through the walls. Can you name the practitioner from the signature? Araminta asked. I can tell you the practitioner had access to the Grimmauld Place library, to Dumbledore's personal binding record, and to restricted Department of Mysteries research from the 1980s. I can tell you the technique matches published work, published in an internal DOM journal in 1985, by a researcher who at that time was in his late 20s, which would make them late 40s now, and who had a specialty in non-consensual magical modification. He paused. The internal journal was authored under a pseudonym, as DOM work is. I can tell you that the pseudonym was B. Heron. Araminta wrote 2 letters on her legal pad. B.H. Barnabas Holt, she said. Ollivander neither confirmed nor denied it. He simply held his tea and looked at the half-finished wand on his bench. I would be very careful, he said, about what you do next. The man I'm describing, if it is the man you're naming, is not someone who makes mistakes through carelessness. He makes very few mistakes at all. Neither do I, Araminta said. I know. He looked at her directly. That's why I sent the report to your intake office. Specifically. He glanced at Hermione. The Black Library at Grimmauld Place, is it still accessible? Harry has the deed, Hermione said. He's the owner. He didn't take anything when he left. As far as I know, the library is intact. If you need physical evidence of the texts used, Ollivander said, you'll need access to that house. And you'll need Harry's permission to use what you find there as formal evidence, since he is the property owner and the subject. He paused. You may also find other things in that library that are relevant. Dumbledore was not the only person who used it. Hermione was quiet for a moment. Then she said, did you know? When Harry came into the shop at 11. Did you know what had been done to him? Ollivander looked at her steadily. I knew something had been done to him. I didn't know the full extent yet. He set down his mug. I want to answer your question honestly, Miss Granger, because I think you're asking it for a reason that matters to you. I knew and I didn't act immediately, because I was afraid, and because Dumbledore was Dumbledore, and because I told myself the documentation was the action. He was quiet for a moment. I was wrong about that. The documentation without the action just creates a very precise record of inaction. Hermione looked at him. Why now? Because I'm 82, he said simply. Because Harry left, which means he survived, which means the immediate danger is past. Because I spent 9 months in Malfoy Manor thinking about the difference between careful and cowardly, and I decided I'd been calling one the other for too long. He picked up the half-finished wand from his bench and turned it in his fingers with the absent precision of someone for whom the tool was an extension of thought. And because the boy walked into this shop at 11 years old and the wand that chose him, 11 inches, holly, phoenix feather, resonated with the specific quality of something that knew it was being asked to do more work than it should have had to. The wand knew the bindings were there. I could feel it in the choosing. The workroom was very quiet. The phoenix feather, Hermione said, slowly. Fawkes. Fawkes, Ollivander confirmed. Dumbledore's phoenix. The wand that chose Harry carried a feather from Dumbledore's own familiar. He looked at Hermione. You can draw your own conclusions about whether that was coincidence. Harry got Hermione's second letter on Tuesday. He read it on the roof in the morning, when the light was still low and the city was doing its unhurried early morning thing. He read her question, "Did any of it feel like me?" and sat with it for a while. He thought about specific moments. He thought about third year, when he'd been furious and frustrated with himself about the Patronus and she'd sat with him in the library for 3 hours working through theory without once suggesting the ceiling might be lower than he thought. He thought about fifth year, when his temper had been at its worst, partly the Horcrux, he knew that now, but also the grinding effort of everything magical being harder than it should have been, and she'd been patient in a way that had sometimes felt like management. Had it felt like her? He thought about that honestly. He thought about Hermione, who loved him specifically and genuinely and had cried actual tears at the thought of him dying, who had gone to Australia and reversed memory charms to give back her parents' sense of themselves. He thought about the person who had done the redirections versus the person he knew. He wrote back, "Some of it felt like something. Not like you specifically, more like a shape in the room that nobody acknowledged. I always knew there were things you didn't say. I thought it was Dumbledore's confidentiality that stopped you. Which it was, partly, so I wasn't wrong, just incomplete. You asked if I knew. I didn't know the specifics. But I think I knew something was constrained. I spent years thinking the constraint was me, that I was simply less capable than the situation required. That the gap between what I could do in a crisis and what I could do when I was calm was a character flaw. Some kind of fundamental inconsistency. It wasn't me. That's what I keep coming back to. Not the anger of it, I'll get to that. Just the fact of it. It wasn't me. Come to the shop on Tuesday. Ollivander has things to tell you that will change how you understand the timeline. You're going to want to be there." He folded the letter and sent it and went back to watching the morning light spread across the city. He'd been doing something in the evenings lately that he hadn't told anyone about. After Kareem went home and Yusef locked up and the courtyard got quiet, Harry went to the roof and practiced. Not small things, he'd exhausted the small things in the first month. He was doing large things now. Structured, controlled, deliberate. He could conjure a full Patronus without a wand. He'd discovered this on his second week in Marrakech and it had stopped him cold, because conjuring a Patronus without a wand was supposed to be theoretical. He'd done it accidentally, thinking about Kareem laughing at the firebolt, and the stag had appeared out of his right hand fully formed and so bright it had lit the whole roof and sent 2 cats and a pigeon into immediate crisis. Since then he'd been exploring the shape of it. He could hold multiple active enchantments simultaneously now, 3, 4, 5, without the grinding drain he'd always associated with magical overextension. He could cast non-verbally with the casual ease that he'd only ever managed before in genuine crisis, and the range of what was available non-verbally he was still discovering it, but it was wide, very wide, in ways that made him understand Hermione's note about the simultaneous enchantments binding in a new and specific way. He didn't feel frightened of it. He didn't feel the need to perform restraint. He was learning it the way he'd learned to fly, not carefully, not with excessive theory, but with his body and his instincts and the particular joy of someone doing the thing they were made to do. He conjured the Patronus on Tuesday evening after he sent the letter and let it run the length of the roof and back, and it was brighter than a Lumos Maxima, brighter than a dozen of them, and it lit the entire neighborhood for about 30 seconds, and from below came Kareem's voice saying Harry in the tone of someone who had just had his life's understanding revised. Harry called the stag back and it dissolved into his hands, warm and golden. "Don't tell your uncle," Harry called down. "He already knows," Kareem shouted back. "He's been pretending not to notice for 2 weeks." Araminta had been back in her Geneva office for 12 hours when Sun's procedural review landed on her desk. It was exactly what she'd expected, a 3-page document questioning whether the intake process for ICW/CR/2198 had followed the correct bilateral notification protocols with the British Ministry, and whether, given the sensitive transitional nature of post-conflict British magical governance, the investigation should be paused pending formal liaison confirmation. She read it once. Then she picked up the phone, Muggle landline, her own installation, not connected to any magical communication network, and called Ajoa Mensah. "I need the Codex reference for Article 12, Section 4 of the ICW Founding Charter," she said, when Ajoa answered. "The one about investigative independence in cases involving multiple member states." 1 second. The sound of pages. Article 12, Section 4, in cases where the subject of investigation is a citizen of one member state and alleged perpetrators hold positions across multiple member states, the lead investigator retains full jurisdictional authority regardless of bilateral notification status, provided the investigation was correctly filed under International Intake Protocol. "Which yours was," Ajoa added. "Which mine was," Araminta confirmed. "Draft me a response to internal review citing that section. Also pull the record of Barnabas Holt's communication with Arvid Sund. I want to see if there's a trail." "There will be," Ajoa said. "I know. But I want the paper." She hung up and looked out her window at Lake Geneva, which was doing its dependable thing of being very beautiful in the afternoon light, completely indifferent to the political machinations of the small humans on its banks. She thought about Holt's timing. The procedural review had come in fast, too fast to have been prepared in response to what she'd found in the archive on Monday. He'd prepared it in advance. Which meant he'd anticipated the archive search, which meant he had a good picture of her investigative methods. He was smart and he was well positioned and he had the institutional weight of 3 decades of careful network building. He also had, based on the young man with the upside-down newspaper, at least one operative watching her. She had Ollivander's 93 pages, Hermione Granger's 20-page technical brief, 3-line items from the Dawn procurement record, a binding signature analysis from Ajoa Mensah, and a private collection of pre-1900 texts sitting in a house in London to which she did not yet have formal access. She pulled out a piece of parchment and wrote 2 words at the top. Harry Grimald. She needed him. Not because she couldn't proceed without him, she probably could, eventually, but because the fastest path to the evidence she needed ran through a house that was his, and through a public record that required his testimony, and because Barnabas Holt was about to make a serious political move and the best counter to a political move was something politics couldn't manage. Harry Potter standing in front of the ICW, unbound and fully himself, bearing witness. She thought about him in that Marrakech courtyard, the quality of that particular stillness, the eyes that held something that was neither anger nor peace but some third thing, more durable than either. She thought about what Ajoa had said. The early ones feel almost like love. She thought about what it meant that every binding on Harry Potter had been placed by someone who claimed to be protecting him, and that the net effect of all that protection had been to give a boy a war to fight with 43 hands tied behind his back, and that he had won anyway, and that the people who'd tied the hands were still, in some cases, in the same rooms where decisions were made. She picked up her pen. "Harry, I need Grimald Place. I need the library specifically. Ollivander has confirmed the pre-1900 texts are there, and they are physical evidence of where the early binding techniques came from. Without them, the chain from the Black Collection to Dumbledore to the Department of Mysteries is circumstantial. With them, it's demonstrable. I also need to tell you that Holt has started moving. He's filed a procedural challenge through internal review. It won't hold, but it buys him time, and he's going to escalate. I expect a ministry sovereignty claim within the week. I need you in London. Not for my investigation, though it would help. For what comes after the investigation, when we get to a hearing and the other side argues that this is a domestic British matter and the subject of the report isn't present to say otherwise. You should also know, the wand that chose you at 11 had a core from Fawkes. Dumbledore's Phoenix. Ollivander believes this was intentional. The letter is not urgent. Take the time you need. But I think you know it's time. Voss she sealed it, addressed it to the Moroccan courier service whose contact she'd acquired from Harry's description, and set it in the out tray. Then she went back to her legal pad and started drafting the counter-response to internal review, which she was going to enjoy writing considerably more than Sund was going to enjoy reading it. Harry had already packed when the letter arrived. Not everything, he wasn't leaving Marrakech for good, or at least he wasn't deciding that yet. He packed his firebolt, the moleskin pouch, a change of clothes, the report. He left his books and the painted box and the good boots he'd bought at the market. He went downstairs and told Yusef he was going to England for a while. Yusef looked at him for a moment with the evaluating gaze of a man who had watched someone arrive broken and leave unbroken and understood the difference. "You'll come back," he said. It was not a question. "The room?" Harry asked. "We'll be here." Yusef handed him the key. "In case." Fatima appeared from the kitchen, established immediately that Harry had not yet eaten, and produced bread and olive oil and the kind of look that communicated that he was not leaving this courtyard without eating, and Harry ate, and Fatima said something in Darija that Karim, appearing from behind the doorframe, translated as she says you should find someone to feed you properly wherever you're going. "Tell her I'll try," Harry said. Karim translated this. Fatima made a sound that conveyed deep skepticism. Karim walked him to the edge of the Medina. They shook hands at the junction with the main road, the formal handshake of two people who had somehow become friends across a significant language gap and didn't quite know what to do with the feeling. "The firebolt," Karim said. "You'll take care of it?" "Always." "And you'll come back?" Harry looked at him. He thought about the cobra on the roof and the bread from Aisha's stall and the call to prayer in the pre-dawn and Fatima's soup. He thought about the specific quality of being somewhere nobody knew your story and you could be simply a person who existed. "I'll come back," he said, and meant it. He walked into a side street, checked that it was empty, and disapparated. He arrived in London, not at the Ministry, not at Diagon Alley, not at any of the places that would have been the obvious choice. He arrived at the end of a residential street in Islington, 2 blocks from a house with the number 12, which was invisible to anyone who hadn't been shown it. He stood on the pavement in the London summer afternoon, which was warm and grey in the particular way of a city that aspired to sunshine and settled for something vaguer, and he looked at the space between numbers 11 and 13. He thought about every time he'd stood here before. The first time, at 12 years old, watching the houses crack open like an accordion to reveal the one in between, the one that smelled of old magic and grief and something underneath both of them that he had later understood was simply the smell of a house that had been unhappy for a very long time. He reached out, not with his hand but with his magic, the way he'd learned to reach over the last 3 months, the river of it, voluntary and warm and entirely his, and felt the house recognize him. The wards answered like a dog recognizing its owner. Number 12, Grimald Place, opened its door. Harry went inside, and for the first time in the house's long and difficult history, the air inside felt like it was waiting for something to begin rather than something to end. He walked down the hallway. Mrs. Black's portrait was silent, the curtains were drawn in front of it, as they'd been left. The kitchen was cold and clean. The library on the first floor was exactly as he'd last seen it, shelves to the ceiling, the old books in their cases, dust on everything. He stood in the middle of it and looked at the shelves and thought, here. He thought about Ollivander's page 78. About the techniques built from texts that should have been destroyed. About the person or persons who had stood in this library, his library, it turned out, though nobody had thought to tell him that mattered, and taken those techniques and applied them to a sleeping child. He felt his magic move in his chest. Not in anger, anger had a specific shape and this was different. This was more like recognition. He pulled out Voss's letter, read the last 2 lines again. The wand that chose you at 11 had a core from Fox. Ollivander believes this was intentional. He thought about that for a long time in the dusty library. Then he took out his muggle pen and wrote at the bottom of Voss's letter, in the small clear writing of someone who had decided, I'm at Grimald Place. Come when you're ready. I've been ready since Marrakech. He sent the reply and sat down on the floor of the library with his back against the shelves, surrounded by the books that had, it turned out, been part of what was done to him, and began to look through them with his own eyes, in his own time, without anyone's permission required. Chapter 4. The charming man Barnabas Holt arrived in London on a Wednesday. He didn't announce it. He took a Muggle flight from Geneva, economy class, window seat, no luggage beyond a carry-on briefcase, and a black cab from Heathrow to a private flat in Kensington that he maintained under a name that was technically his middle name combined with his mother's maiden name, which made it both legally accurate and practically invisible. He'd maintained the flat for 11 years. The neighbors knew him as a consultant who traveled frequently and kept irregular hours. He left milk on their doorstep once when the elderly woman in 4B was ill. He was, by all observable metrics, a perfectly unremarkable neighbor. He unpacked his briefcase, made coffee, and stood at the window looking at the street below. He had 3 things to accomplish in London. The first was a conversation with the Minister for Magic, which was arranged for Thursday morning and which Holt expected to be straightforward. The minister was a man in search of stability and Holt was very good at presenting himself as stability. The second was a quiet meeting with 2 senior ministry officials he'd worked with before the war, both of whom owed him favors of the durable kind. The third was more delicate. He needed to know what was in the Grimald Place library. Not because he didn't know, he knew exactly what was there. He'd used those texts himself. He'd built 12 bindings from techniques drawn from the Phineas Nigellus Black collection with the systematic efficiency of a craftsman working from a well-sourced materials list. He needed to know because if Voss had connected the Black collection to the binding signatures, the texts themselves became physical evidence, and physical evidence sitting in a privately owned building required either a warrant or the owner's cooperation to be admissible in an ICW hearing. Harry Potter owned the building. The calculation was therefore, could Harry Potter be persuaded, redirected, or otherwise managed in such a way that access to the library became either impossible or inadmissible? Holt ran the assessment honestly, which was his practice. He did not flatter himself with easy answers. The answer, assessed honestly, was, probably not through persuasion. The boy had read the report. He was in London. He was not hiding. He was not, by any behavioral indicator Holt could read, in the reactive traumatized state that would make him susceptible to the kind of careful framing that worked on damaged people. That left inadmissibility. Specifically, if the library could be designated a site of historical magical significance, which the Black collection arguably qualified for, given the pre-Victorian materials, access could be subject to Ministry Heritage Review, which would require a formal assessment process lasting months. Long enough to push the evidence window past the ICW's standard hearing timeline. Long enough for the political landscape to shift. He sat down at his desk and wrote a letter to the head of the ministry's Magical Heritage Office, who was a woman he'd known for 20 years and who owed him a favor he'd been saving for exactly this kind of situation. Then he wrote his notes for the minister's meeting. Holt was not, as he sat writing in his Kensington flat, performing villainy. He was not twisting a metaphorical mustache or rehearsing speeches about sacrifice and necessity. He was doing what he always did, working a problem with methodical intelligence, evaluating variables, applying leverage where it was available. The fact that the problem was a 19-year-old whose autonomy he had systematically violated for years was, to Holt, a variable rather than a moral weight. He had made the moral calculus in 1997 and he had not revisited it since, because revisiting it would require him to change either his conclusion or his assessment of himself, and he was not prepared to change either. He finished his notes, reviewed them once, and went to bed at 10 o'clock. He slept perfectly. Harry found the texts on his second day in the library. They were behind the legitimate Black family histories on the 3rd shelf from the bottom, not hidden, exactly, just shelved in the way that things get shelved when the person doing the shelving assumes only people who know what they're looking for will look. The collection was smaller than he'd expected, 6 volumes, bound in black leather with no titles on the spines, the pages dense with handwritten notes in several different hands. The oldest material was in Latin, which he couldn't read. The more recent annotations, and recent was relative, since the most recent appeared to be from the 1870s, were in English. He'd been working through them with the methodical attention of someone who has decided to understand every part of what happened to him, which was different from the compulsive rereading of the first week in Marrakech. This was deliberate. He read slowly, noting the techniques described, occasionally finding himself reading something with the specific recognition of this is what that felt like, and making himself continue rather than stop. Binding techniques for reducing innate magical output in children. Modifications designed to sit beneath a standard diagnostic scan. Methods for layering new bindings through existing ones without disturbing the surface resonance. He found, in the 5th volume, a section that someone had marked with a strip of dried lavender, faded, old, but deliberate. The marked section described a specific technique for magical bonding suppression. He read it and thought about what Ollivander had written on page 44. Binding 11, Suppression of Capacity for Deep Magical Bonds with Other Persons. Placed October 1981. October 1981. He'd been 15 months old. He put the book down carefully on the floor beside him and sat for a moment. The library was quiet. Grim old place made its old house sounds, the settling of beams, the particular creak of the third stair, the distant percussion of London traffic that was always there and always distant, as though the house existed slightly outside of ordinary geography. He thought about the dried lavender. Someone had marked this passage. Someone had sat in this library and marked this specific page and then used it. He thought about Dumbledore, who had been in this house many times and had known its library and had used it and had marked the bonding suppression technique with a strip of lavender, and he thought about the fact that Dumbledore had loved him. He believed that. He believed it specifically and without sentimentality, the way you can believe something true about a person and also believe they did something unforgivable, both things occupying the same space, neither one canceling the other. He picked the book back up. On the facing page, in the same margin that held the lavender, there was a note in Dumbledore's handwriting. Small. Almost a footnote to himself. The child must not form early bonds that could be leveraged. Protection requires isolation from that vector. Reverse before Hogwarts if stable. Harry read it 3 times. Reverse before Hogwarts if stable. He hadn't reversed it. Harry had arrived at King's Cross at 11 years old and met Ron Weasley on the platform, and the bonding suppression had still been in place, and it had remained in place for the next 7 years, and through the friendship and through the war and through every moment that should have been fully felt and was felt instead through that pane of glass Hermione had put words to. If stable. The qualification. The condition that had remained unfulfilled. Dumbledore had told himself there would be time. That he would revisit it. That the architecture of protection was temporary and he'd dismantle it before the costs became irreversible. He hadn't. Harry put the book in his moleskin inner pocket alongside the report and stood up and went to the kitchen and made tea, which was the thing you did in Britain when you needed something to do with your hands and your mind was doing complicated things. The kitchen at Grimmauld Place had always been slightly better than the rest of the house, more functional, less oppressive, because the kitchen was where Molly Weasley had cooked and talked and been entirely herself, and that energy had settled into the walls. Harry leaned against the counter while the kettle boiled and looked at the room and thought about what he was going to say to Voss when she arrived and what he was going to say, eventually, not today, to the people who had loved him and who had participated, knowingly or not, in the structure of his diminishment. He thought, I'm going to need that library intact and accessible when Voss gets here. He thought, which means I need to know if anyone is going to try to take it. He thought about this with the specific strategic attention that had always been his most underrated quality, the thing that people missed because it didn't look like strategy, it looked like instinct, but it was both, it had always been both. He thought about the political landscape Voss had described. The procedural challenge. The anticipated ministry sovereignty claim. The shape of a man who had spent a career making problems disappear through institutional machinery. He made his tea and drank it standing up, the way he preferred, and by the time the mug was empty he knew what he needed to do first. The Minister for Magic's name was Thaddeus Brine, and he had been in office for 11 weeks and was already the palest Araminta had seen a sitting minister look outside of a genuine crisis, which suggested he was treating the ordinary chaos of post-war governance as a genuine crisis, which meant he was not going to weather what was coming particularly well. She hadn't asked for the meeting. He'd sent for her. This was interesting in itself, because it meant someone had told him she was in London, which meant Holt's network was faster than she'd estimated. She filed that away and went to the ministry on Thursday morning by the Muggle entrance, the red phone box, which always struck her as the kind of detail a theatrical person had installed, and was escorted to the minister's office on level 1 by a harried-looking assistant who clearly had 7 things that needed doing simultaneously and was giving 6 of them to her escort task. Brine was behind his desk when she came in, and he had the look of a man who had been told that a specific conversation was necessary and had been preparing for it the way people prepare for things they don't want to have. Barnabas Holt was sitting in the chair to the right of the desk. Araminta registered this without expression and sat in the remaining chair and accepted the offer of tea, which was made by the harried assistant and arrived in a ministry mug with the department crest, which told her the minister had not upgraded the crockery since Scrimgeour's tenure and probably other things. MS. Voss, Brine said. Thank you for making time. Of course, she said. She looked at Holt. Barnabas. Araminta. Holt smiled, a genuine smile, warm and direct, the smile of a man who had spent 30 years becoming excellent at projecting trustworthiness. He was silver-haired and well-dressed and had the quality of solidity that came from deep certainty, the kind of certainty that never needed to perform itself. She had met 3 people in her career who scared her through sheer competence, and he was one of them. It's been too long. Stockholm, 2003, she said. The Ericsson case. I remember. You were brilliant. I know. She looked back at Brine. Minister. You asked to see me. Brine cleared his throat. He was in his late 50s, gray-haired, with the slightly overwhelmed quality of a competent administrator who had been promoted to a job that was less about administration and more about navigation. I understand you have an active investigation under case CR/2198. I do. The subject of which is Harry Potter. The subject of which, Araminta said precisely, is 43 illegal magical bindings placed on Harry Potter without his knowledge or consent over a period of approximately 18 years. Mr. Potter is the victim, not the subject. I want to be clear about that distinction. A small pause. Holt's expression didn't change. Of course, Brine said. The concern, Ms. Voss, is one of jurisdiction. The events described in the report occurred within British magical territory, involving British citizens, under the governance of the British Ministry, several of which involved personnel from the Department of Mysteries, Araminta said, and all of which violate ICW codes that supersede domestic jurisdiction in cases of non-consensual magical modification. I've sent the relevant codex references to internal review, who have, I'm sure, passed them along. Brine looked at the papers on his desk. He'd been briefed. The briefing hadn't made him confident. Barnabas has been advising me, Brine said, that the appropriate course might be a joint investigation, combining ICW resources with the Ministry's own. The Ministry's own investigative resources, Araminta said, would be investigating the Ministry's own potential involvement in the later bindings. That is not a joint investigation. That is a conflict of interest with extra steps. Another pause. Holt shifted slightly in his chair, not uncomfortably, with the ease of someone making an adjustment they'd anticipated. Araminta, Holt said, in the tone of a man having a collegial conversation between professionals rather than the argument it actually was. I think the minister's concern is reasonable. This is a sensitive period for British magical governance. The war ended 3 months ago. The community is rebuilding. An ICW investigation of this scope, of this, personal nature, given who the subject is, victim, Araminta said, could be destabilizing. That's not a justification for inaction. It's a practical consideration about how and when action is taken. How and when, Araminta said, have a way of becoming weather, in my experience. Holt smiled again. It was a good smile. It communicated respect and regret simultaneously. I've read Ollivander's report. It's extraordinary work. I don't dispute the technical findings. What I question is whether the ICW's standard accelerated timeline serves Harry Potter's interests, or whether a more careful, coordinated approach, Mr. Potter's interests, Araminta said, are something Mr. Potter is quite capable of speaking to himself. Holt paused. It was a short pause. A trained observer would have clocked it at just under 2 seconds. But it was there, the first micro-adjustment she'd seen from him, the first moment where his model and the incoming information didn't quite align. Has he been in contact? Brine asked. He's in London, Araminta said. She did not specify where. He's been in contact since I went to Marrakech. He's aware of the investigation and he supports it. She looked at Holt. He's also aware of the procedural challenge filed through internal review, which I've already addressed with the relevant codex citations. If the ministry intends to file a formal sovereignty claim, I'd appreciate knowing now so I can prepare the appropriate response before the ICW's next full session. Brine glanced at Holt. Holt said, that's not currently on the table. Which meant it was currently on the table and he'd decided, in the last 30 seconds, to not make it the first move. Araminta drank her tea. Good, she said. Then we agree the investigation proceeds under ICW jurisdiction. I'll send the formal notification through the correct channels. She set down her mug and stood. Minister. Thank you for the meeting. Mr. Holt, lovely to see you. She walked out before either of them could recalibrate. She was on the embankment 20 minutes later, walking fast in the direction of the Muggle phone box that would take her back down to the atrium, when her watcher appeared again. Same young man in the grey robe, different newspaper, equally bad at surveillance. She stopped, turned, and looked at him directly. He froze. Come here, she said, in the tone she used for people who needed to understand immediately that there was no version of this conversation where she was at a disadvantage. He came. He was perhaps 23, with an anxious face and the look of someone who had taken a job he'd thought was administrative and discovered otherwise. I've known you were following me since Tuesday, she said. You are not good at this yet, but you might become good at it if you get better training, which is not something Barnabas Holt is going to provide because he is not interested in your development, he is interested in your function. What's your name? He stared at her. Perkins, he said, slightly dazed. William Perkins. Who sent you? A pause. The calculation behind his eyes was legible, loyalty versus the obvious truth that she already knew everything. Mr. Holt, he said. What were you instructed to report? Your movements. Meetings. Who you spoke to and for how long. And the Grimald Place address, have you reported that? A longer pause. I don't know the address. I've only followed you to the ministry and your hotel. She looked at him steadily. He was, she decided, not actively malicious. He was 23 and working for someone who understood how to use the not actively malicious people very well. Stop following me, she said. If Mr. Holt asks whether I noticed you, say yes. He'll know you're telling the truth and it will tell him that his operational security has a gap, which is useful information for both of you. If you want to leave his employment and you need a reference, contact my office. She left him on the embankment looking as though his understanding of the next several years of his life had just been briefly revised. Harry was at the kitchen table with 5 of the 6 black volumes, a Muggle pen, and a notebook when Voss arrived at Grimald Place. He heard her knock, 2 sharp raps, the sound of someone who knocked the way they did everything else, and went to let her in without looking through the peephole first, because the wards had announced her before she reached the door, and he was starting to rely on that, the house's particular awareness of what was coming. She came in, looked at the hallway, at the blank space where Mrs. Black's portrait curtains hung, at the general atmosphere of the house, which was better than it used to be but still had the quality of somewhere that had been sad for a long time. "Nice house," she said, in the tone of someone being rigorously neutral. "It's complicated," Harry said. "Coffee?" "God, yes." He made coffee. He'd found the kitchen reasonably stocked. Apparently someone on Dumbledore's old order payroll had been maintaining the house, which was a discovery he was going to examine later, and they sat at the kitchen table and he pushed his notes toward her. "I found the texts," he said. "The pre-1900 collection. 6 volumes, third shelf in the library, behind the black genealogy section. I've been going through them." She picked up his notes. She read them with the focused attention he was coming to recognize as her default mode, completely still, moving only her eyes, the whole quality of her concentration narrowing to the page. "This one," she said, pointing to his note on the 5th volume. "The bonding suppression section. Marked with dried lavender," Harry said. "Dumbledore's handwriting in the margin." She looked at him. "You found his notes?" "One note. 4 words." He told her what it said. She wrote it down on her legal pad, added an asterisk, circled the asterisk. "That establishes the chain," she said. "Black collection, to Dumbledore's direct use, documented in his own hand. That's the origin of the early bindings." She set the pen down and looked at him properly. "How are you?" It wasn't asked in the soft clinical way of someone following a protocol. It was a direct question from someone who genuinely wanted the accurate answer. "Fine," he said. "Better than fine." He wrapped his hands around his coffee mug. "I found a note in my own handwriting in the margins of Volume 3. She stilled. "What?" "Not my handwriting," he corrected. "Someone imitating my handwriting. It's good, it would fool most people. But it's slightly too neat. I write under the line on letters. Whoever did this writes on the line." He slid Volume 3 across to her, open to the page. "Binding 17. The one on instinctive magical defense. Someone has annotated it in what looks like my handwriting. The note says see also Ministry of Magic Binding Supplement, 1994. It's dated August 1994. Voss looked at it for a long moment. "Someone tried to plant your signature on a DOM supplementary binding." "They were thorough," Harry said. "If I hadn't spent the last 3 months learning what my own magic actually looks like, what it actually feels like, I might not have spotted it. Someone wanted these texts to look like they'd been accessed with my knowledge. To undermine Ollivander's finding that you never consented." "Yes." Voss picked up her pen and wrote, "Evidence tampering. Grimmauld Place Library, Volume 3, Binding 17 annotation. Timeline, planted pre-investigation, or." She stopped. Looked up. "How was the house when you arrived?" "Wards intact. Fully intact and keyed to me. Nobody got in after I left." He paused. "Which means someone got in before." "Before you left for Marrakech," she said. "Before the battle, maybe. Or in the period between the battle and your departure, when the house was accessible to people who knew the location. The Order of the Phoenix had known the location." Harry looked at the ceiling for a moment. He thought about the period after the battle, the days at the Burrow, the funerals, the ministry owls about transitional governance, and how easily he could have been redirected back to Grimmauld Place for some errand or another, given access to the library, framed as having accessed these texts himself. Someone had planned for the possibility that the bindings would eventually be investigated. Someone had prepared a defense that cast Harry as a participant. "Holt," Harry said. "The planted annotation is consistent with his methodology," Voss said. "It's sophisticated, it's deniable, and it's the kind of preparation that happens years in advance." She photographed the page with her camera, careful and precise. "I met him this morning. At the ministry. With Brine. How was he?" "Excellent," she said, and meant it as an assessment rather than a compliment. "He's good, Harry. I want you to understand that. He is not a man who panics or makes impulsive moves. He's running a calculated campaign to either redirect or delay this investigation past the point of consequence, and he has significant resources to do it with. What's his next move? I think he came to London specifically to try the ministry's sovereignty angle, but he backed off it in the meeting. He'll find another lever. She tapped her pen against the legal pad. He may try to go through you directly. Harry looked at her. He'd approach me. He might. Not clumsily, not with a threat or a deal. He'd try to frame it as a conversation between equals. He believes, genuinely, that what he did was necessary and rational, and that if he explains the reasoning to you, you'll understand even if you don't approve. He's the kind of person who thinks being understood is almost the same as being forgiven. Harry was quiet for a moment. Let him. Voss raised an eyebrow. If he comes to talk to me, Harry said, I'll talk to him. I want to hear what he says. He looked at her steadily. I want to hear him explain it. Not because I'm going to be convinced. Because the explanation is evidence, and I want to have it. She looked at him for a long moment with the expression of someone recalibrating slightly upward. If you do that, you do it with my knowledge. And if he makes any move that could be construed as intimidation or obstruction, it gets documented. Agreed. He picked up his coffee. What do we need for the hearing? The texts, photographed and preserved. Your testimony. Ollivander's testimony. Ajoa's technical analysis. Hermione's brief. She paused. And the Dawn procurement records I found in the Ministry archive. They established the chain from Holt's consultancy to the binding placements. She looked at him. I also need to formally document the evidence tampering in this library. That's an additional charge, obstruction of an ICW investigation. Add it, Harry said. She added it. They worked through the afternoon, Voss photographing and cataloging the library, Harry walking her through the volumes, both of them building the structural case with the focused efficiency of two people who had, separately, already done most of the hard thinking and were now assembling. Hermione arrived at 4. She came in through the door Harry held open and stood in the hallway of Grimmauld Place, which she hadn't been in since the previous year, which felt like a decade, which was a house she associated with planning and fear and the particular specific energy of 4 teenagers pretending to be soldiers, and looked at Harry. He looked at her. She said, I got your letter. About coming here. I know. You came. Yes. She seemed to be trying to find the right calibration. You look different. I am different. I know. She looked at her hands, which had flour on them again, which Harry suspected was something she did when she was anxious, the way some people went for a walk or cleaned. I need to say something and I need to say it without preamble because every time I've practiced the preamble it sounds like a justification. Say it, he said. I'm sorry. Simple. Direct. No performance. Not for the decisions I made at 17 with the information I had, I can reconstruct the reasoning and I understand why I made them. I'm sorry that I chose Dumbledore's word over your right to know. I'm sorry that I was so certain I understood the protection that I forgot to check whether you needed the same protection from the protectors. She looked at him. You asked in your letter whether it felt like you. Like me, I mean. I need to know. Harry looked at her for a long moment. This was Hermione, the real version, the one he'd always known was under the careful management of herself, standing in the hallway of a house that had never been comfortable, being honest with him in the specific way she was honest when she was done being defensive, which was the most honest he'd ever seen anyone be. You were the best friend I had, he said. That was real. That didn't have a binding on it. Whatever Dumbledore asked you to do, and I know he asked it in a way that made it feel like loyalty rather than compliance, you were also just there, all the time, and that part was yours. He paused. The pane of glass I described, that wasn't your fault. It was placed on me at 15 months old. You couldn't have broken through it even if you'd known it was there. Hermione made a sound that was not quite a word. Her eyes were doing the thing again. Don't, Harry said, gently. We've got work. She took a sharp breath, nodded once, and looked at Voss, who had appeared from the library doorway. The technical brief. Have you? It was excellent, Voss said. I need 2 more things from you. The specific timeline of Dumbledore's conversations with you, with as much exact language as you can reconstruct. And a second pass on bindings 32 through 43. I think there may be DOM procedural language embedded in the techniques that you're better placed to identify than Ajoa. Hermione was already heading for the library. I'll need the volumes. 3rd shelf, Harry said. Behind the genealogy section. She went. Harry followed. Voss came last, closing the kitchen door behind her. The ICW's formal monthly session was held in Geneva on the last Friday of every month, in a chamber on the building's 2nd floor that was designed to seat 60 representatives and usually seated 40, because 1/3 of the ICW's member states were represented by people who attended only the sessions they needed to. Barnabas Holt attended every session. He sat in the British seat, which was technically the seat of the British ICW representative, a role he'd held for 7 years, with the specific quality of someone who had arranged the room around himself before anyone else arrived. He knew the space. He knew the people. He knew which representatives were movable and which were immovable and which were movable only in directions he controlled. He had come to this session with one objective, to have Voss's investigation formally reviewed for procedural compliance by the full ICW body, rather than just internal review. It was a subtle escalation. Internal review's procedural challenge was a stall tactic. A full-body review motion would require Voss to appear before the chamber and defend her intake methodology, which would take time and political capital and would signal to every member state that the British ICW representative had concerns about the investigation's legitimacy. He stood and made his motion 12 minutes into the session, after the opening procedural items had cleared. He framed it carefully. He didn't attack Voss. Attacking Voss would look defensive, and Holt never looked defensive. He framed it as concern for the integrity of the process, as a question of whether the proper bilateral notifications had occurred, as something he raised in the spirit of institutional diligence rather than opposition. He sat down and waited. Araminta Voss, in the visitors' gallery that ran along the north wall of the chamber, stood up. The chamber went quiet in the specific way of a room whose collective attention has just been recalibrated. I'm not a member of this body, she said, but I believe I have the right to respond to a motion that directly concerns my investigation, and I'll be brief. The chair, a Finnish wizard named Lautanen who had known Voss for 20 years and was, Holt noted, carefully expressionless, nodded. Article 12, Section 4 of the Founding Charter, Voss said. Investigative independence in multi-state cases. I've filed the relevant notification with internal review. The intake was compliant. She paused. However, since this motion has been made, I think the chamber should know that my investigation has now identified evidence of tampering with physical evidence at a privately owned property in London. The tampering is recent, methodologically sophisticated, and consistent with the work of a practitioner with unspeakable level training and access to the original binding record. She looked at the chamber. Not at Holt. At the chamber. I'm sharing this because evidence tampering in an active ICW investigation is itself a Category 1 offense, and I believe this body should know the motion before it today was filed in the context of an investigation that has just expanded in scope. The chamber was very quiet. Holt's expression didn't change. This was the thing she found genuinely impressive about him. Most people, when surprised by incoming information in a public forum, showed something. Holt showed nothing. He sat in the British seat with the same quality of considered ease he'd had when the session opened, and looked at Lautanen, and said, calmly, I withdraw the motion. He said it without explanation. Without justification. Without anything that suggested he was retreating. He simply withdrew it. Because making the motion now, after Voss had put evidence tampering on the public record, would look like exactly what it was. The session moved on. Harry wasn't in Geneva. He was in the Grimald Place library at the same hour, sitting cross-legged on the floor with volume 4 in his lap, when the door between the library and the hallway opened and admitted a man he didn't know. He knew who he was. He'd been described precisely enough. Silver hair, excellent robes, the quality of unhurried solidity. The wards had let him in, which was interesting, and told Harry that Holt had been in this house before, recently enough that the ward still carried his signature as a recognized visitor. Harry looked at him without getting up. "Mr. Potter," Holt said. His voice was exactly what Voss had prepared him for, warm, measured, the voice of someone who had spent decades communicating. "I am a reasonable man having a reasonable conversation." "Mr. Holt," Harry said. "How'd you get past the wards?" "I was here last February," Holt said, which was the most direct confirmation Harry had expected. "The wards recognized a prior authorized entry. You haven't refreshed the perimeter exclusion since you reoccupied." "Noted," Harry said. He looked at the man calmly. "You came to talk." "I came to talk." Holt looked around the library with the ease of someone who had been in it before and was therefore not performing familiarity. His eyes moved over the shelves, and Harry watched to see whether they went to the third shelf, and they did, a brief involuntary check, there and gone in a second. "They're in my pocket," Harry said. "The volumes you're thinking about." Holt looked at him. Something behind his eyes adjusted. "You're perceptive. I've been told." Harry set the remaining volume on the floor beside him. "Sit down if you want. I'm not going to make this performative." Holt sat in the armchair across from him, the only armchair in the room, which Harry had put there specifically. He sat with the ease of someone who sat in armchairs the way he did everything else, as though the space had been arranged for him. "I want to explain my reasoning," Holt said. "I know," Harry said. "Go ahead." And Holt did. He talked for 25 minutes. Harry let him. He didn't interrupt. He didn't perform anger or incredulity. He sat with his back against the shelves and his hands loose in his lap, and he listened to Barnabas Holt explain, in the careful language of genuine conviction, why a child's magical autonomy had been a threat to global stability that required management, why the decision to maintain and extend the bindings during the war had been the most rational option available, why the alternative, a fully unbound Harry Potter, unpredictable and ungoverned, entering a war, was a risk that nobody in any responsible position could have accepted. He explained it well. He was not lying. He believed it. Every word. When he finished, Harry was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You think power that can't be controlled is inherently dangerous?" "Yes," Holt said. "And you think it was your job to decide what level of power I should be allowed to express?" "Someone had to," Holt said, and the absolute absence of apology in his voice was, Harry thought, the most honest thing about him. "You were 19 years old and unbound and fighting a war. The calculus required management. And now I'm 19 years old and unbound and not fighting a war," Harry said. "What does your calculus require now?" Holt looked at him steadily. "I came here because I think we can reach an arrangement that serves both our interests. The investigation proceeds, findings are documented, appropriate oversight is established going forward, Harry said. "Yes. An arrangement by which your development is monitored by an agreed body, with agreed parameters, for an agreed period. In exchange for which, the investigation concludes without criminal proceedings." Harry looked at him. He looked at him for a long, specific moment. Then he said, "No." Holt waited, as though expecting qualification. Harry didn't add any. "No," he said again, simply. "You built a cage. You want to build a smaller one and call it a compromise?" The answer is no. There is no arrangement. There is no agreed monitoring. There is a report, and an investigation, and an ICW hearing, and you are going to sit in that hearing and answer for what you did. He paused. "I'm not angry at you," for what that's worth. I understand what you believed. I just don't accept it. Holt was quiet for a moment. Then, you understand what a full hearing means. The attention. The exposure. Everything about your history becomes public record. My history already is, Harry said. That was done to me too. Holt stood. He straightened his robes with the unhurried precision of someone who didn't let small physical things become expressive. I think you're making an error, he said. You've thought that about me since 1997, Harry said. You were wrong then. Holt looked at him one last time, the assessing look of someone revising a model, and left. Harry listened to the front door close. Then he picked up the last volume, turned to the page with the planted annotation, and wrote in the margin beside it, in his own handwriting, writing under the line on letters the way he always did, "This is not my writing." H. J. Potter, August 1998. He took the moleskin inner pocket out of his jacket and added volume 3 to the collection. Then he pulled out the muggle pen Voss had left on the kitchen table and wrote a brief message on the back of an envelope. He was here. He offered an arrangement. I declined. He confirmed prior access to the house, February, last year. He checked for the volumes. I have everything. We're ready. He sealed it and sent it to Geneva. Outside, London was doing its evening thing, the city settling into itself, the light going amber, somewhere a bus, somewhere a siren, the vast and indifferent machinery of a city that had existed for 2,000 years and would exist for 2,000 more and had seen more momentous things than one conversation in a library where a man had offered a cage and been told, clearly and without anger, no. Harry sat in the library a while longer. He felt the house around him differently than he ever had before, not oppressive, not sad, not the weight of the Black's long unhappiness. Just a house. Old and complicated and containing, in its library, the physical record of what had been done to him, which was also the evidence that would undo it. He thought about Holt's eyes when he checked the shelf. He thought about the way the man had sat in the armchair with absolute confidence that he could engineer an outcome. He thought, you've never met anyone who can't be managed. He thought, you're about to. He closed the last volume, tucked it away, and went to make dinner in the kitchen of Grimmauld Place, which was, by any measure that mattered, his. Chapter 5, 43. The owl from Voss arrived at 6 in the morning with a note that said 3 things. Hearing date confirmed, Friday, 2 weeks. ICW Chamber, Geneva. Full session, open record. Holt has filed a countermotion through the Belgian representative, arguing the investigation constitutes political persecution of a sitting ICW member. Laudanum has allowed it on the docket. It won't succeed, but it will require a response. I need you in Geneva by Wednesday. Not Thursday. Wednesday. Bring Ollivander if he'll come. Harry read it over his coffee, standing at the kitchen window of Grimmauld Place, watching the early morning light do its tentative London thing on the courtyard outside. He'd been in the house for a week now. It had stopped feeling like a place he was visiting and started feeling like a place he was using, which was different and better. He wrote back immediately. Wednesday. Ollivander is coming, I asked him yesterday. He said yes before I finished the sentence. One thing first. I'm going to the ministry. He sealed it and sent it, then went upstairs and changed his clothes. He hadn't told Voss why he was going to the ministry because the reason was his and he hadn't fully shaped it into words yet. He'd been thinking about it for 3 days, since the conversation with Holt in the library, since he'd sat in Grimmauld Place afterward and felt the specific quality of what it meant to have said no to the offered cage and meant it without performance or anger. The thing was this, the ministry currently existed in the fog of post-war reconstruction, moving fast to fill the institutional vacuum left by a year of Death Eater occupation, and in that fog a significant number of people who had made significant decisions were making more decisions, still in their chairs, because nobody had stopped long enough to account for what those decisions had been. Holt's network ran through the ministry. The Dawn procurement record sat in ministry archives. The Heritage Office he'd leveraged to try to restrict the Grimald Library, that had been a ministry mechanism. Harry was not going to the ministry to cause a scene. He was not going to threaten anyone or make speeches. He was going because there was a specific person he needed to speak to and because that conversation needed to happen before a Geneva hearing made it impossible to have in private. Kingsley Shacklebolt. Kingsley had been named interim minister in the immediate aftermath of the battle and had then formally stood for the position in June, which he'd won by a significant margin because he was competent and steady and had the specific quality of a man who had been on the right side of a war and was broadly trusted. He was also someone Harry had known since before 5th year, had trained under, had trusted, had listened to in the order meetings he wasn't supposed to be at and had attended anyway. He was also someone who had been head of the Auror office during the period in which the Dom's last bindings had been placed, and who had been, technically, in a position to either know or not know what the unspeakables were doing. Harry needed to know which. He took the tube from Angel, which he'd been doing all week because Muggle transport was fine and he didn't feel like being recognized coming out of a fireplace in the ministry atrium with 20 people watching. He emerged at Westminster, walked the familiar distance to the red phone box, dialed the sequence, descended. The atrium was busy in the mid-morning way of a working ministry, people crossing with folders and quills, a cluster of Aurors near the security desk, the general sense of an institution attempting to reconstitute itself with the urgency of something that had stopped functioning and hadn't quite remembered how to restart. There was a new mural on the far wall, replacing the blood status monument that had apparently been destroyed in the battle. This one was painted in warm colors and showed witches and wizards of various descriptions standing in a circle, which was either genuinely aspirational or deeply cynical and possibly both. Harry walked across the atrium with his hands in his pockets and his head up. He was recognized immediately. He had known he would be and had decided not to care about it. 2 people stopped walking and stared. A young Auror near the lifts went visibly rigid and then overcorrected into a kind of elaborate casualness. A witch carrying a stack of folders said something to her colleague that was clearly about him. He met none of their eyes with any specific invitation to conversation and kept moving. He took the lift to level 1. Kingsley's assistant was a young man named Forsyth who stood up immediately when Harry came through the door and said, "Mr. Potter, the minister doesn't have, tell him Harry's here," Harry said. "He'll have time." Forsyth relayed this with the faintly dazed expression of someone following an instruction they didn't fully understand but sensed was correct, and 30 seconds later Kingsley's voice came through the door saying, "Send him in." Kingsley had filled the minister's office like he'd always been in it, which was the best sign Harry could think of for anyone in the position, that the space fit rather than overwhelmed. He was standing when Harry came in, which was Kingsley's version of ceremony, and he extended his hand. Harry shook it. "You're back," Kingsley said. Simply, without editorial. "For now," Harry said. He sat in the chair across from the desk. Kingsley sat. "I need to ask you something directly and I need a direct answer." Kingsley looked at him steadily. Of everyone Harry had known through the war, Kingsley was the one whose face gave the least away as a matter of default rather than practice, not coldness but control, the trained composure of a career Auror who had learned to be unreadable because unreadable was functional. "Go ahead." The Dom, 1997, Autumn. "Were you aware of any non-standard research operations involving a living subject?" A pause. Short but specific. "I was aware," Kingsley said, "that there were unspeakable operations during that period that fell outside my purview as head of Aurors. I wasn't given details. I wasn't asked for authorization." Another pause. "I asked about it once. I was told it was a sanctioned classified operation and that the details were above my clearance level." "Who told you that?" "Holt," Kingsley said. The name came out flat and deliberate, the way you say something you've been waiting to say. "He came to my office in September 1997. He told me there was a classified DOM operation directly relevant to the war effort that was being handled at the senior level and that I didn't need to be concerned with it." His jaw tightened slightly. I accepted that because the war was 4 weeks from its worst point and I had 17 other things happening simultaneously, and because Holt had a reputation for precision that I trusted. And afterward? After the battle, in the weeks after, I started asking questions. Holt was in Geneva by then. The DOM records from that period are classified to a level that requires a ministerial order to access, which I have been preparing. He looked at Harry. I heard about Ollivander's report 10 days ago. From a source in the ICW. Not through official channels, someone who thought I should know. He met Harry's eyes. I've been waiting for you to come back. Harry looked at him for a moment. Did you know about the earlier bindings? Dumbledore's. No. Immediate and unqualified. I knew Dumbledore made decisions about you that he didn't fully account for. I knew there were things about your situation that weren't being told to you. I thought, he stopped. I thought the things being withheld were operational intelligence. War strategy. I didn't consider the possibility that they were things being done to you rather than simply kept from you. Harry nodded. He believed Kingsley because Kingsley was telling him with the specific quality of a man who was also angry, not at Harry, not at the situation abstractly, but at himself for the precise shape of what he'd not questioned and why. That quality of specific self-directed anger was, Harry thought, the most honest version of an apology available to someone who hadn't known enough to prevent something. There's an ICW hearing in 2 weeks, Harry said. Voss is running it. The evidence is solid, texts, procurement records, Ollivander's documentation, binding signature analysis. Holt is going to try every procedural avenue available to him between now and Friday. He looked at Kingsley. I'd like the ministry to stand with the investigation. Not neutrally. Actively. Kingsley was quiet for a moment. Harry could see the calculation, not self-protective calculation, the calculation of a man assessing what was possible and what was necessary. If the ministry takes an active position, it implicates the ministry in the events. We become a party rather than a bystander. Yes, Harry said. Some of the people in this building made decisions that your report names. Yes. You understand what that means for the post-war, Kingsley, Harry said. Not sharp. Just direct. I fought a war for the wizarding world. I did it bound. I didn't know I was bound and the people who knew didn't tell me. I won anyway. He paused. I'm not asking the ministry to fall on a sword. I'm asking it to stand up in a room and say what happened, happened. The wizarding world has a choice between rebuilding something honest or rebuilding something that looks like the old thing with different furniture. I know which one you want. Kingsley looked at him for a long time. I'll have a formal ministry statement supporting the ICW investigation on Voss's desk by Monday, he said. And the DOM records from that period will be declassified by ministerial order by end of week. Harry stood and extended his hand. Kingsley shook it. Welcome back, Kingsley said. I haven't decided if I'm back, Harry said. I've decided I'm here. That's different. He left the way he came, through the atrium, across the new mural, up through the phone box into the Westminster morning, and the city was doing its thing around him, huge and ordinary and entirely indifferent. He thought, Wednesday. Hermione came to Grimmauld Place on Tuesday afternoon with 2 bags and a look on her face that said she had done a great deal of thinking and had come out the other side of it carrying something heavy and intact. She set the bags on the kitchen table. One contained books. The other contained food, proper food, not ministry canteen standard, but things she'd bought from the market on Hampstead High Street with the specific intentionality of someone feeding people rather than fueling them. Harry watched her unpack without saying anything and then said, "You're coming to Geneva." It wasn't a question. She paused unpacking. Voss asked me, she said. I said I'd come if you wanted me there. I want you there. She resumed unpacking. Ron's coming too, she said, with the careful neutrality of someone unsure how this information would land. He came to see me yesterday. I told him about the report, not everything, not the full 100 pages, but enough. She set down a jar of something. He cried, Harry. Properly. He sat at my kitchen table and cried, which is the only time I've ever seen him do that without trying to stop himself. And then he was furious, and then he said he wanted to come. Harry was quiet for a moment. Ron. He'd thought about Ron, had thought about him differently than Hermione, because Ron hadn't been asked to do anything, hadn't been given specific instructions. Ron had just been Harry's best friend for 7 years, across all of it, and whatever the bonding suppression had done to Harry's capacity for deep magical connection, Ron had been there anyway, in the imperfect version Harry had been able to manage, and that had been something. Tell him yes, Harry said. She let out a breath that had been holding itself. Okay. They made dinner together in the Grimmauld Place kitchen, actual dinner, not the thing they used to do during the hunt which was more functional than food, and Hermione told him about the second pass on bindings 32 through 43 and what she'd found in the Duem-specific language, which was technical and significant and which Harry listened to while he was peeling potatoes because he was apparently still capable of doing 2 things at once, though that was, per binding 14. More functional now than it had been yesterday. He told her about Kingsley. She put down the thing she was doing. He's going to declassify the DOM records. By end of week. That's, Harry, that's the whole chain. That's everything. I know. She looked at him. How did you get him to do that? I asked him directly. She made a sound. You walked into the Ministry of Magic on your own and asked the Minister for Magic to declassify classified records, and he said yes. Harry. Hermione. She picked up what she'd been doing and shook her head. You're different, she said. You said that already. I'm saying it again because it's still true. She glanced at him sidelong with the look he recognized, not admiration exactly, but something adjacent to it, the look she got when she'd understood something important and was working out what to do with the understanding. Are you all right? Actually, he said, and thought about it honestly, which was a thing he was doing more now, being honest with himself about what he was feeling rather than filing it in a drawer marked deal with later. Yes. I'm angry. I'm going to stay angry for a while. But under the anger I think I'm okay. The anger doesn't scare you? No. He thought about the Patronus on the Marrakech roof, flooding the neighborhood with gold. The anger's mine. It's the right size for the thing it's responding to. I'm not going to do anything wrong with it. She nodded. She believed him, which was the most honest form of trust, not because she was being loyal but because she'd assessed it and found it accurate. They ate dinner and talked, not about the report for a while, just talked, about her parents, who were almost restored, about Crookshanks who had been staying with Ginny and had apparently decided this was fine, about Morocco, which she wanted to hear about properly. He told her about Kareem and Yusuf and Fatima and the snake on the roof, and she laughed, actually laughed, the sharp surprised laugh she made when something caught her off guard, at the Cobra conversation about temperature. You talked to a snake about weather, she said. It was a good conversation. I'm sure it was deeply meaningful. It was, a bit. She smiled at him. He smiled back. There was still something between them that was working itself out, the specific complexity of 2 people who loved each other and had been imperfect for each other and were now being honest about both simultaneously, but it was workable, and for Harry, workable was enough. The port key to Geneva left from a ministry departure point on Wednesday at 7 in the morning and deposited them outside the ICW building at 8:15, which was the particular disorientation of long-distance magical transport that Harry had never quite gotten used to. He was carrying his own bag and his firebolt, strapped to his back with a muggle carrying strap he'd had made in Marrakech, and he noticed the looks this got from the ICW security staff at the entrance, who processed his entry with the specific expression of people who had been briefed about him and were choosing professional neutrality. Ollivander had come separately, arriving the night before. He met them in the lobby, thin and precise and wearing robes that were somewhat better than his usual, which Harry suspected was Ollivander's version of formal preparation. He shook Harry's hand and looked at him the way he always looked at things he'd made, with the attention of someone checking that their work had held. "The holly wand," he said. "I don't have it anymore," Harry said. "It broke." "I know. I heard." Ollivander looked at his hands. "You don't have a wand." "I don't need one." Ollivander was quiet for a moment. Then he made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh but was something. "No," he said. "I imagine not." Ron arrived an hour later, taking the stairs two at a time with the long-legged stride of someone who walked fast when he was nervous. He was taller than Harry remembered, or not taller, just more solidly himself, the way people become more entirely who they are after something large happens to them. He'd cut his hair shorter. He looked, Harry thought, like someone who had spent 3 months thinking seriously and had reached some conclusions. He stopped when he saw Harry and looked at him with the direct, unmediated quality that had always been Ron's particular superpower, the inability to perform emotional complexity, which meant that what you saw on Ron's face was exactly what was there. "You look like you," Ron said. "I am me," Harry said. "I mean, more. You look like more of you." He shook his head. "That's not, I've been trying to say this properly for 2 weeks." He stepped forward and they did the shoulder grip thing that was their version of everything that took other people 5 minutes to express. When they stepped back, Ron said, "I read the report. Hermione showed me the summary. The bonding suppression, the one from when you were 15 months old," he stopped. His jaw was set. "I wanted to hit something for 2 days. I know the feeling." Is it gone? "That one?" "All of them are gone," Harry said. "Since the forest." Ron processed this. His expression moved through something complicated and came out the other side looking very slightly broken and then reassembling itself. "So, all the times, we were properly friends." "We were properly friends," Harry said. "The suppression reduced my capacity to anchor, not to feel." "We were real, Ron." "All of it." Ron nodded. He looked at the ceiling for a moment with the expression of someone preventing a specific biological response through sheer force of character. "Okay," he said. "Good." He looked back at Harry. "Right. So what do we do?" "We go to a hearing," Harry said. "And we let the record speak." The ICW chamber at full session was a different thing from the partial sessions Voss had been working within. All 60 seats were occupied. There were observers in the gallery, journalists, magical and muggle alike, because at some point in the last week the existence of the investigation had leaked beyond the sealed intake offices and was now known in broader terms to anyone paying attention to international magical governance. Voss had not been surprised by this. She suspected Holt had engineered the leak himself, that he'd calculated a public hearing was better for him than a private one, because in a public forum the political framing became available in ways it wasn't in closed session. If that was his calculation, Harry thought, watching from the gallery as the chamber filled, he had significantly miscalibrated the variable. Araminta stood at the investigator's table with her legal pad and 3 folders and the particular quality she had in professional settings of someone who has long since stopped finding rooms like this impressive and now simply finds them functional. Ajoa Mensa sat to her right. A second ICW lawyer, a woman named Patel, London-based, brought in for the British law elements, sat to her left. The Belgian representative filed Holt's countermotion at the opening of the session. It was longer than the previous motion, 6 pages, read into the record by the Belgian with the careful enunciation of someone reciting someone else's argument, and it argued, essentially, that the investigation was politically motivated, that the evidence had been selectively assembled, and that the subject of the report had not been fully assessed for competence to consent to his role as complainant. Competence to consent. Harry, in the gallery, heard that phrase and felt his magic move in his chest with the specific warmth of an entity recognizing an insult. Voss stood to respond. "The subject of this investigation," she said, "is not the complainant. Garrick Ollivander is the complainant. Mr. Potter is the victim of the actions being investigated, and his competence is not at issue. She set down the response motion she'd prepared. Additionally, the countermotion raises the question of selective evidence assembly, which I'll address by inviting this chamber to review the complete case file, which I'm entering into the public record now, in full, without redaction. She placed 3 large folders on the clerk's table. 93 pages of Ollivander's report. Hermione's 20-page technical brief. Ajoa's binding signature analysis. The Dom procurement records, newly declassified. Kingsley had been as good as his word, arrived on Voss's desk Friday morning. The Grimoald Library evidence, photographed and catalogued. The planted annotation in Volume 3, documented and signed by Harry. All of it. Public record. The Belgian representative looked at the folders. Holt sat in the British seat with his unchanged quality of composure. The Ministry of Magic of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, Voss continued, has submitted a formal statement in support of this investigation, which is included in the case file as Attachment 7. A murmur moved through the chamber. Holt's composure held. But he looked, very briefly, at the folder on the clerk's table, and Harry, watching from the gallery, thought, "You didn't know about Kingsley. That's the first thing you didn't anticipate." The procedural phase lasted most of the morning. Voss argued and Holt's representatives argued and Laughton ran the session with the focused authority of someone who had been in this room for 25 years and had seen every variety of procedural theater and was not impressed by any of them. The Belgian motion was discussed, amended, partially accepted in a procedural sense that Harry didn't fully follow but Voss had assured him was meaningless, a decorative flag plant, nothing structural, and the session moved into what Voss had told him was the substantive phase. Ollivander testified first. He came to the witness chair with his cane and his careful precision and he testified for 90 minutes without notes. He described his methodology. He described the binding architecture. He described, in the specific language of a craftsman who understood both materials and their misuse, exactly what had been done and how it had been done and the technical evidence for each of the 43 entries in his report. He was extraordinary. Harry had not quite understood, until he watched Ollivander in the ICW chamber, what 93 pages of careful, lifelong documentation looked like when spoken aloud by the person who had written them. It looked like someone who had spent 31 years preparing to tell the truth and had finally arrived at the place where it could be told. Nobody challenged him effectively. Holt's representative tried twice and both times Ollivander dismantled the challenge with the patient precision of someone who expected less knowledge from the opposition and was not surprised to find it. Ajoa testified in the afternoon. Technical, clear, relentless. She translated the binding architecture into language the full chamber could follow, and when she reached the post-1997 section, the 12 Duhem-sourced bindings, she laid the technical evidence for authorship on the table with the same unhurried precision Voss used for everything. The methodology is documented in a 1985 internal DOM paper. The paper was authored under a pseudonym. The pseudonym's authorship is established by the procurement records showing BH as the contracted researcher for that year's restricted project. The chamber was quiet in the specific way of 60 people processing something they hadn't expected to be quite so clear. Hermione testified on Wednesday afternoon. Harry watched her from the gallery. This was the part he had been thinking about, the part he hadn't known how to prepare for, because Hermione being honest in public about the thing she'd done was going to be different from Hermione being honest in private, and he didn't know what it was going to cost her and had no way to mitigate it. She came to the witness chair and sat straight-backed, the way she sat for everything, and answered every question Voss asked her with a precision and directness that was, Harry thought, more honest than was required. She wasn't asked to name herself as culpable. Her role had been that of a minor who'd been instrumentalized by an authority figure, and Voss's questions were carefully framed to establish what Hermione had been told and what she'd been asked to do, not to establish blame. But Hermione went further. When Voss asked what she'd been told about the binding's purpose, Hermione answered, and then said, unprompted, I want to add that I understood, on some level, that there were things I wasn't questioning that I should have questioned. I was 17 and I trusted an authority figure, but I was also old enough to ask the question I didn't ask, which was whether Harry knew. I didn't ask it. I think this chamber should have that on record. Voss looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you, Miss Granger." Harry looked at his hands in the gallery. He thought about the pane of glass. He thought about every moment it had been there, study sessions and battles and quiet evenings at the burrow and the tent during the hunt where everything had been so hard and so cold and the three of them had been so tired, and he thought about how the glass had been placed in him before he could object, and how the people around him had either not known or had known something and had done their best or had known and made a calculation. He thought about all of it and found, sitting in the gallery of the ICW chamber in Geneva on a Wednesday afternoon, that what he felt was not hatred, not bitterness, not the clean consuming rage that would have been easier. What he felt was grief. A specific, proportional grief for the version of things that had not been, for the full, unbound years of friendship and love and ordinary growing up that had been available to him and had been taken, and underneath the grief, something else. Something like readiness. Thursday was Holt's day. His representative argued the counter-motion, not the political persecution framing, which had lost its structural support when the ministry came out formally behind the investigation, but a refined version of the necessity argument. That the bindings had been placed in the context of extraordinary circumstances. That the intent had been protective and stabilizing. That the outcome, a living Harry Potter who had ended the war, demonstrated the efficacy of the approach. The representative made this argument carefully and professionally and in good faith, and Harry, sitting in the gallery, listened to every word of it and thought about how the argument was, in its own terms, not entirely wrong. The intent had been, in some cases, protective. The outcome had been survival and victory. These were true things. They were also not the point. They were not the point because the point was not outcomes. The point was that no person's magic, no person's capacity for connection, for power, for full embodied selfhood, was a resource to be managed by any other person's calculation, regardless of intent, regardless of result. The point was that the world did not get to decide what Harry Potter was allowed to be, even when the world was frightened of it, even when the world had decided it was for his own good, even when the world had wrapped the cage in love and called it protection. He'd been thinking about how to say this. He'd been thinking about it since Marrakech, actually, since the fourth reading of the report on the roof with Kareem kicking his heels on the parapet. He'd written drafts in the notebook he'd bought at the market in his second week, not formal statements, just thoughts, the way you write things down not to record them but to find out what you think. What he thought was simple. He was going to say it simply. Voss had told him Thursday afternoon, after Holt's representative concluded. The chair is offering you the floor. It's not standard testimony at this stage, formally we've closed the evidence phase. But Laughton has discretion to allow personal statements and he's exercised it. Good, Harry said. You don't need notes, she said. I know. She looked at him with the expression he'd come to recognize as her version of confidence, not reassurance, because she didn't offer reassurance as a tool, but a direct, honest assessment. You understand what you're doing. I do. Ron appeared in the corridor behind Voss's shoulder and gave Harry a look that communicated several things simultaneously. I'm here, you're ready, stop standing in the corridor, and Harry straightened his jacket and went in. The chamber was full. He walked from the gallery entrance to the floor with 60 representatives watching and the observers gallery above watching too, and the journalists in the press section, and he didn't perform anything. He didn't project authority or swagger or any of the things he'd seen powerful people do when they wanted a room to know they were powerful. He just walked. Himself. The way he'd been walking around Marrakech for 3 months, the way he walked Grimmauld Place in the evenings, the way he'd walked into Kingsley's office, like someone who had exactly as much right to be wherever they were as anyone else present. He sat in the witness chair and looked at the room. Thank you for allowing me to speak, he said. He had a low, clear voice that didn't need amplifying in this space, the chamber's acoustics did the work. I'm not going to provide additional evidence. The evidence is complete. I want to say something about what the evidence means, and I want to say it on record. The chamber was very quiet. 43 bindings, he said. The first placed when I was 4 months old. The last placed when I was 17. I fought a war with 43 modifications to my magical capacity that I didn't know were there. I lived the first 19 years of my life as a diminished version of myself, and the people who did that to me, some of them loved me. That is true, and I'm not going to pretend it isn't. He paused. But love doesn't give you the right to decide what another person is allowed to be. Even when you're afraid of what they are. Even when you've decided the world needs them to be something specific. Even when you've convinced yourself that the cage is kindness. He looked at the chamber. He looked at Holt's seat. Holt was there, composed, watching him with the attentiveness of a man who had made a career out of assessing things accurately and was now assessing this. I'm not standing here for justice in the sense of punishment, Harry said. I'm not interested in watching people I've known and in some cases loved be destroyed by institutional process. I'm standing here because this chamber needs to decide something, and the decision has to be made on a full record, not a managed one. He looked at Laudanum. The decision is whether the magical world accepts that what was done to me was acceptable in its terms. Whether the management of a person's inherent magical capacity, without their consent, for institutional convenience, however well-intentioned, is a thing this body will name as wrong. He was quiet for a moment. Not wrong because it was done to Harry Potter, he said. Wrong because it can be done to anyone. The techniques in the Grimmauld Place library predate me by 150 years. The research in the Dom's restricted archive is still there. The capability exists. The question is whether the governance exists to match it. He looked at the room again. I'm 19 years old and I am, apparently, the most powerful living witch or wizard in the world, by several measurements. I have heard that used as a justification for everything that was done to me, because the world was frightened of it and thought it needed managing. He let that sit for a moment. I am not dangerous because I am powerful. I am dangerous to no one who is not choosing to be dangerous to someone else. The bindings did not make me safer. They made me useful. There is a difference. He looked at the chair. That is all. He stood and walked back to the gallery. The chamber was silent for approximately 4 seconds after he sat down. Then it erupted in exactly the kind of noise that large rooms make when a significant number of people have had their thinking revised simultaneously. Ron leaned over from the seat beside him and said, quietly, "That was properly brilliant." Harry looked at his hands. "I just said the thing. The thing was brilliant." Hermione, on his other side, was looking at the chamber with wet eyes and the expression of someone calculating 6 things simultaneously as a coping mechanism. She reached sideways and took his hand without looking at him, and he let her. Holt left the chamber at the afternoon break. He walked out through the side door with the unhurried quality he always had, and Harry, in the gallery, watched him go. He didn't make it a significant moment. Holt going through a door was a man going through a door, and Harry didn't need it to be anything more dramatic than that. But Voss appeared at his shoulder and said, quietly, "He's going to make one more move." "I know," Harry said. "He's going to try to argue in closed session tomorrow morning that the evidence tampering charge undermines the investigation's credibility, that it introduces a taint that requires the full evidentiary record to be reviewed before any ruling." Can he do that? Procedurally. He can request it. Laudanum has discretion. She paused. But the request requires Holt to be present in closed session, and in closed session his representatives can't carry the argument for him. He has to speak directly. Harry looked at her. "You want him in closed session?" "I want him on record. In his own words. Making the argument that what he did was necessary." She met his eyes. "Because that argument, made by him in the context of an active investigation into his conduct, is an admission." Harry thought about the library. Holt in the armchair, explaining his reasoning with absolute sincerity. The certainty in the man's voice, not aggressive, not performative. Genuinely convinced. He thought about what Voss had said in Marrakech. He believes if he explains the reasoning to you, you'll understand even if you don't approve. He thought about the difference between understanding something and accepting it. He'll make the argument, Harry said. He can't help it. It's the only argument he has that he actually believes. Voss nodded. Then let him make it, Harry said. Outside the ICW building, Geneva was doing its dependable and beautiful thing. The lake glittered at the end of the avenue in the late afternoon sun. A tram went past. Somewhere across the water the Alps stood in their enormous and unhurried way, the kind of scenery that makes the machinery of human politics look exactly the size it is. Hermione had appeared at his elbow. Then Ron. Then Ollivander, who had emerged from the building's side entrance with the cane and the precise movements and a look on his face that Harry could not quite categorize until he recognized it, slowly, as relief. The old man looked at Harry and said, 11 inches. Holly. Phoenix feather. How does it feel? Harry thought about the Patronus on the Marrakech roof. The gold in his palms. The text on page 78 of the report in his pocket. The dried lavender in volume 5. Like mine, he said. Ollivander made the sound that wasn't quite a laugh but was something close. Yes, he said. That's exactly right. They stood outside the ICW building in the Geneva afternoon, the four of them, and for a moment nobody said anything because nothing needed to be said. The hearing had 1 day left. The evidence was in the record. The room had heard. Tomorrow Holt would make his argument and Voss would be ready for it, and whatever came out the other side would be whatever it was. Harry felt the city around him, the size of it, the ordinariness of it, the way life simply continued, massively and indifferently, around any single human event no matter how significant it seemed from inside it. He thought about Marrakech. He thought about Karim. He thought about the key in his pocket that Yusef had pressed into his hand, in case. He thought, whatever comes after this, I choose it. He thought, that's what 43 bindings couldn't stop. He put his hands in his pockets and started walking toward the lake, and after a moment the others fell in beside him, the way they always had, and the evening settled over Geneva golden and clear and entirely ordinary. Chapter 6. What he chose. The closed session was scheduled for 9 in the morning and Holt arrived at 8:40. Harry knew because Voss told him, and Voss knew because she had been in the building since 7, which was the kind of thing she did not mention but which Harry had come to understand was simply how she operated, arriving before the room was set, knowing the space before anyone else could shape it. She met Harry in the corridor outside the chamber with coffee in a paper cup and her legal pad under her arm and the specific quality she always had before something significant, which was no different from how she looked any other time. He filed the closed session request at 11 last night, she said. Laudanum granted it at midnight. Did you sleep? Harry asked. Some. She handed him the coffee. I want to talk you through what's going to happen. Closed session means the observer gallery is empty. Press is out. Only chamber members, the investigation team, and any named parties. She looked at him. You're a named party. You have the right to be present. I'll be present. He's going to make the necessity argument. Sophisticated version, he's had 12 hours to refine it. He'll frame it as a systemic question rather than a personal defense. He'll argue that the investigation, if it results in a ruling against him, creates precedent that restricts future governance of exceptional magical capacity, and that this precedent represents a genuine security risk. He's not wrong that it creates precedent, Harry said. No, Voss said. That's exactly what it's supposed to do. He drank the coffee. It was better than the ministries and not as good as Marrakech. What do you need from me? Nothing, in closed session. You're there to witness. If Laudanum offers you the floor, take it. But let Holt go first and let him finish. She paused. He's going to look at you when he speaks. He'll address the room but he'll direct the argument at you. Don't let that become a conversation. I know, Harry said. She looked at him with the evaluating attention that he'd been the recipient of since Marrakech, the look of someone who had started an assessment and was periodically updating it. You understand how this ends? Tell me. There are 3 possible outcomes from today. First, Laudanum accepts Holt's argument and orders a full evidentiary review, which delays the ruling by months and may compromise several evidence chains. Second, Laudanum rejects the argument and proceeds to ruling, which happens as early as this afternoon. Third, she paused. Holt recants. Withdraws the countermotion and accepts the investigative findings. This makes the ruling procedurally simpler and removes the evidentiary review question. He won't recant, Harry said. No, she agreed. He won't. I just wanted you to know it was on the table. Ron appeared from the lift at the end of the corridor, Hermione behind him, both of them carrying coffee and wearing the expressions of people who had spent the previous evening alternating between strategy and the particular exhaustion of waiting for something you can't accelerate. Ron handed Hermione her cup without looking, the automatic courtesy of years of proximity, and looked at Harry with the question he didn't ask aloud. We go in at 9, Harry said. Ron nodded. Hermione adjusted her bag strap and looked at the chamber door with the focused attention she gave to exams and battles and other things with definite structures. Her expression was something Harry had been watching develop over the last week, a kind of settled resolution, the expression of someone who had moved through the painful phase of understanding their own role in something and arrived at the phase of doing what was possible. Ollivander came from the other direction, unhurried, his cane precise on the marble floor. He looked at the 4 of them assembled in the corridor and said, "Good morning," with the satisfied air of someone for whom this gathering represented the correct conclusion to something long in progress. At 9 o'clock exactly, the chamber door opened. Closed session had a different quality than full session. 60 seats were occupied when every member was present. In closed session with most gallery observers gone, the room felt more deliberate, each of the 41 representatives present more individually visible, the weight of individual judgment more apparent. Laudanum sat at the chair's bench with 2 senior clerks. The investigation table held Voss, Ajoa, and Patel. The named party's bench held Harry. Holt sat in the British seat. He sat with the same quality he always had, unhurried, grounded, the composure of someone who inhabited rooms rather than performing in them. He had prepared. Harry could see it in the arrangement of the pages before him, the specific order of a man who had organized his argument the way he organized everything else, methodically, comprehensively, with full confidence in its structure. Laudanum opened the session and gave the floor to Holt's representative. The representative stood and said that his client wished to address the chamber directly. Laudanum nodded. Holt stood. He looked at the chamber first, a specific, moving regard, meeting the eyes of representatives he'd worked with, representatives he'd negotiated with, representatives who owed him and representatives who didn't. He was not performing. He was communicating, with the precise efficiency of someone for whom every room was also a network. Then he looked at Harry. He held that for a moment. Then he began. 43, he said, and the number in his voice was neither defensive nor apologetic. It was the number as a fact, stated by someone who intended to explain the facts. 43 modifications to one person's magical capacity, beginning in 1980 and ending in 1997. I'm not here to dispute the number or the documentation. Ollivander's report is meticulous. I respect the work. He looked at the chamber. I'm here to provide the context that the investigation has documented without, and without which this chamber cannot make a fully informed ruling. He spoke for 40 minutes. He was, Harry thought, listening, one of the most effective speakers he'd ever heard. Not because he was charismatic, charisma was a performance and Holt didn't perform. He was effective because he was genuinely intelligent and genuinely believed what he was saying, and genuine belief, when expressed by an intelligent person, had a persuasive quality that theater could never replicate. He talked about magical governance, the history of it, the specific challenges posed by exceptional magical capacity in an era before the ICW's codification of individual rights, and then in an era after it, when the codes existed but the practical problems they'd been designed to address hadn't gone away. He talked about what it meant to govern a community that contained individuals whose magical capacity exceeded, by orders of magnitude, anything the governance structures could check or balance. He talked about 1997. About the war. About the specific calculation, and he used the word calculation without apology, that an unbound, fully capable Harry Potter entering a war was a variable that no responsible governance actor could leave unmanaged. He said, not because I doubted him. Because I was responsible for outcomes that no single person's judgment, including his, could be trusted to determine alone. He talked about the outcome. The war had ended. Voldemort was dead. Britain's magical community was rebuilding. The world was, by any objective measure, better for the conclusion of the events of May 1998. Then he looked at Harry again. I have considerable respect for Mr. Potter, he said. Not because he survived what was done to him, though that is extraordinary. Because of what he did with what remained available to him, under conditions no human being should have been asked to operate under. That respect is genuine. He paused. I am asking this chamber to consider whether the precedent this investigation creates, if the findings result in a ruling that prohibits all management of exceptional magical capacity without full consent, creates governance problems that this body is currently not equipped to solve. He sat down. The chamber was quiet. Laudanum asked Voss if she wished to respond. Voss stood. Briefly, she said. Mr. Holt has made an argument that I expect this chamber to take seriously, because it raises a genuine question. The genuine question is, how does a governance body manage the risk of exceptional individual magical capacity? She paused. The answer is not this. The answer is never this, the suppression of a person's inherent capacity without their knowledge, applied in infancy, maintained through childhood and adolescence and into a war they were asked to fight on behalf of the people suppressing them. She looked at the chamber. The question of how we govern exceptional capacity is a real question that deserves a real answer. That answer requires building frameworks, not cages. It requires consent, not management. It requires treating the person as a partner in the governance process rather than a variable in it. She sat down. The investigation's findings stand. Laudanum looked at Harry. Mr. Potter. The chair recognizes you. Harry stood. He had not prepared what he was going to say. He'd made a decision about that the night before, lying in his hotel room listening to the Geneva traffic, that the prepared version would be less accurate than the honest version, and that accuracy was what the record required. Mr. Holt, he said, and looked at the man directly. You said you respect me. Holt looked back at him. I do. I believe you, Harry said. That's the thing I've been sitting with since you came to my library. The respect is real. The conviction is real. You genuinely believe that what you did was necessary and that the outcome justifies the method. He paused. I understand that. I don't accept it, but I understand it, which is a distinction I want to make clearly on the record. He looked at the chamber, all of it, the 41 representatives, Laudanum at the bench, the clerks, the investigation table, Ollivander in the named parties section with his cane and his careful hands. Mr. Holt said I did extraordinary things with what remained available to me, Harry said. He's right. I did. I survived. I fought. I won. Bound. He let that sit for a moment. I want this chamber to think about what that sentence means. Bound. 43 modifications in place, I still managed to do the things that apparently justified the 43 modifications being there. He shook his head, not in anger, in the specific clarity of someone who has thought about something until it is fully clear. The necessity argument has it backwards. The bindings were not what made the outcome possible. They were what made it harder. And harder is not the same as safer. It is not the same as better. It is just harder, for the person carrying the weight. He looked at Holt one more time. You ask this chamber to consider the governance problem of exceptional magical capacity. I agree it's a real problem. I'm telling you now, as the person you were governing, that the answer you chose was wrong, not because it failed, but because it started from the premise that my capacity was a problem to be solved rather than a person to be worked with. He sat down. That's the precedent I want this chamber to set. Not that powerful people are ungovernable. That they are people. Start there. Laudanum recessed the chamber at 10:50 and returned at 12:15. Harry spent the recess in a small conference room down the hall with Ron, Hermione, and Ollivander. Ron paced. Hermione read something on her legal pad. Ollivander sat with his hands around a tea mug and his eyes on the middle distance. Harry sat on the windowsill looking at the Geneva street below and thought about nothing specific, which was a skill he developed in Marrakech and found increasingly useful. At one point Ron stopped pacing and said, "What do you think he decides?" "Laudanum?" Harry said. "Yeah. I think he does the right thing," Harry said. "Which is also the procedurally complicated thing, which is also the thing that creates the precedent Holt is worried about." He looked at the street. "I think he knows what this case is. He's known since Voss filed it." Ron sat down. "And after? What happens to Holt?" "Voss will recommend prosecution," Hermione said, without looking up from her pad. "The evidence is sufficient for a full criminal charge under ICW codes. Non-consensual magical modification, Category 1 through 4, multiple counts. Evidence tampering." She paused. "He'll get a proper trial. What happens there depends on a lot of things." "Do you want him prosecuted?" Ron asked Harry. Harry thought about Holt in the library armchair. The silver hair and the good robes and the absolute sincere certainty. "I want him accountable," he said. "I want a record that says what he did. What all of them did. I want the 43 bindings named, specifically, as crimes, not regrettable decisions, not protective measures applied in difficult circumstances. Crimes." He paused. "What happens to him after that, I genuinely don't have strong feelings. I'm not carrying his fate around. I've got enough to carry." Ron nodded slowly. "What about Dumbledore?" It was the question that had been in the room since Marrakech, since the first reading of the report. Harry had been living alongside it for months, turning it over, holding it at different angles. "Dumbledore is dead," he said. "He can't be prosecuted. He can be named in the record, and he should be. Voss is doing that. The dried lavender and the handwritten note in the margin go into the public record. What he did is documented." He looked at the street. "I'm not going to carry him either. I loved him. He loved me. He also built the first 11 locks on the cage, and those are both true and they're going to stay both true for the rest of my life." He paused. "That's what it is." Hermione set down her pad. She looked at him with the expression that meant she was about to say something she'd been not saying, which was a thing she did less often now than she used to, the gap between thinking and speaking having narrowed in her over the last 2 weeks. "I'm proud of you," she said. Simply. Harry looked at her. "Don't, I'm saying it and you can't stop me." Her voice was firm. "Not for this. Not for the hearing or the statement or any of the things that were brilliant and you know were brilliant. I'm proud of you for leaving in May and going to Morocco and figuring out who you were when nobody was asking anything of you. That's the thing. That's the one." Harry was quiet for a moment. "The Cobra conversation helped," he said. Ron made a sound. "There was a cobra? On the roof? Why was there, you know what, fine. Brilliant. A snake helped Harry Potter figure out his life, this is somehow exactly right." Harry laughed. The conference room was small and full of sunlight and the sound of the three of them in it had the specific quality of something resumed, not as though 3 months of silence hadn't happened, but as though it had been absorbed into the thing, made part of it, the way breaks in music are part of the music. Ollivander looked at all three of them over his tea mug with the expression of someone watching something that has finally arrived at its correct configuration. The ruling took Lawton 2 hours. It was thorough. Harry read it afterward. Voss handed him the full text in the corridor outside the chamber, warm off the ICW printing office, and he stood there in the corridor and read it while Ron looked over his shoulder uninvited and Hermione looked over his other shoulder with more subtlety but identical intent. The ruling found as follows. That the 43 bindings documented in Ollivander's report constituted illegal magical modifications under ICW Codes 14 through 31. That the modifications had been placed without the knowledge or consent of the subject. That the modifications had materially impaired the subject's magical development, personal autonomy, and capacity for human connection over a period of approximately 18 years. That the modifications placed by Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, 11 in number, were found to be violations of the same codes, and that Dumbledore's death did not eliminate the historical record of these violations, which were now formally entered into the ICW's public register. That the modifications placed by Barnabas Theodore Holt, 12 in number, constituted the most severe violations documented, characterized by deliberate, sophisticated methodology undertaken by a trained professional who understood the legal prohibitions and circumvented them intentionally. That these violations were compounded by subsequent evidence tampering, constituting a separate Category 1 offense. That a full criminal prosecution under ICW codes was ordered, with Holt suspended from his ICW representative role pending trial. That the case established a formal precedent, entered as ICW Precedent 2198 HJP, holding that no member state, institution, or individual held the authority to modify the magical capacity of any person without full informed consent, regardless of the basis for such modification, and that the governance of exceptional magical capacity required consent-based frameworks, not suppressive ones. That subject Harry James Potter was entitled to full formal recognition of the violations against him and to whatever remedies the ICW's victim reparations process could provide. Harry read the last paragraph twice. He folded the document and put it in his pocket alongside Ollivander's report, which was still in the inner mokeskin pocket where it had been since Marrakech. The two documents together were not particularly heavy, which surprised him slightly. He'd expected the weight of them to be physical. Voss appeared at his shoulder. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed. "The criminal prosecution process will take time. Holt's lawyers are good. He'll fight it." "I know. The precedent is the thing," she said. "The prosecution matters, but the precedent is what changes things." She paused. "You understand that what you said in there this morning, the start there, will be cited in governance discussions for the next 50 years. He thought about that. "Good," he said. She looked at him with the expression she'd had since Marrakech, the periodically updating assessment, and said, "What are you going to do now?" It was the question he'd been asked in various forms since he left Britain in May. What are you going to do? What comes next? What does Harry Potter do when there's no war, no enemy, no specific task? He'd been thinking about the answer for 3 months and he'd arrived at it slowly, not as a plan. Plans were, as Yusef's nephew had said, wishes that knew what they were doing, but as a direction. "I'm going back to Marrakech first," he said. "I told Yusef I'd come back. I have a room." Voss raised an eyebrow. "And after?" "After, I want to learn things. Properly. Without someone deciding what I'm allowed to learn." He looked at the corridor wall. "I want to know the full range of what I can do. Not to use it for anything specific. Just to know it." He paused. "And I think I want to do what you do." She looked at him. "Investigations," he said. "People who have had things done to them that nobody official wants to look at. I know something about that." He met her eyes. "I'll need training." Voss was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "You're 19. I've been told. You would be the most recognizable investigator in the history of this institution." "Useful sometimes," Harry said. "Problem other times." frequently problem. I can work with frequently problem. She looked at him for another moment. Then she said, come to my office in Geneva in the spring. We'll see what you've got. She walked away down the corridor without looking back, which was, Harry had learned, her version of yes. Holt was in the corridor when Harry came out of the session. He was standing near the far exit with his two lawyers, the case documents under one arm, his expression doing the thing it had done throughout the hearing, held, composed, not visibly diminished. He was not performing dignity under pressure. He simply had it, the specific unperformable dignity of a man who genuinely believed in the rightness of his own position and was not going to revise that belief because a ruling had gone against him. He looked at Harry when Harry came out. Harry stopped. They were about 15 feet apart. The corridor was occupied but not crowded, Holt's lawyers, a clerk moving past, someone from the investigation team at the far end. There was no particular reason for the pause to become significant. Harry crossed to him. He stopped about 5 feet away and looked at the man with the straightforward, unperformed attention he'd been giving things since Marrakech, seeing them clearly, not making them smaller, not making them larger. You're going to fight the prosecution, Harry said. I am, Holt said. You're going to make the necessity argument in that trial too. Yes. And you're going to believe it. Yes, Holt said. Simple. Unashamed. Harry nodded. I know, he said. I understand why. I want you to understand something from me, which is that your belief in the necessity doesn't change what it was. You can be certain you were right and still have done wrong. Those aren't contradictions. He paused. I don't hate you. I want you held accountable. Both of those are true at the same time. Holt looked at him for a moment with the assessing quality that had characterized every interaction between them. You're going to be formidable, he said. Not a compliment exactly. An assessment. I know, Harry said. He walked past Holt and down the corridor and out the building's main doors into the Geneva afternoon. The city was bright and clear in the way of alpine summer, the kind of light that had depth to it, the mountains visible at the far end of the lake. Ron and Hermione came out behind him, then Ollivander, moving more slowly. Nobody said anything for a moment. They stood on the steps of the ICW building and let the afternoon do what it did. Food, Ron said, eventually. God, yes, Hermione said. They found a place near the lake, a terrace restaurant with white tablecloths and menus in 4 languages, and ate for 2 hours, which was the right amount of time for a meal that was also something else. Harry ate a great deal and said relatively little and felt the afternoon move around him, the sun going gradually from gold to amber, the lake glittering in its dependable way, the city carrying on. Ollivander told a story about a wand commission he'd received from a Hungarian wizard in 1967 that went spectacularly wrong in a way that turned out to be the wizard's fault rather than the wand's, which had a precision of detail and a dry comic delivery that made Ron choke on his wine. Hermione told them about the second time she'd gone to see her parents, post-restoration, when her mother had made a comment about her hair that was so completely the comment her mother would make that Hermione had started crying in the middle of her parents' kitchen, and her mother had held her and neither of them had explained to the other why this was happening but both of them had understood. Ron looked at his glass when she said this and Harry looked at the lake. Where do you go next? Ron asked Ollivander. Home, the old man said. The shop. I have a commission, Rowan and Dragon Heartstring, 11.5 inches, for a girl who starts Hogwarts in September. I am already behind schedule. He looked at Harry. Will you come to Diagon Alley before you leave for Morocco? Yes, Harry said. Good. I have something for you. Harry looked at him. What? Come and see. He picked up his tea with the precision of someone who had said exactly what he intended to say and had no intention of elaborating. They stayed until the sun was low and the lake turned orange and someone at a nearby table was celebrating something with a bottle that made a significant sound when opened. Ron ordered dessert with the decisiveness of someone who had earned it. Hermione revised her notes from the hearing on a piece of paper she'd produced from her bag, which was so characteristic that Harry felt the warmth of it like something physical. He looked at them, Ron gesturing with his dessert fork to make a point about something Quidditch adjacent, Hermione half listening while writing and providing accurate counterarguments at 1/3 attention, Ollivander watching them with the settled amusement of someone for whom the most interesting thing in any room was always the people in it, and felt, with a clarity that was almost startling, that the pane of glass was gone. Not metaphorically. Not as a conclusion he'd reached. As a felt thing, the specific warmth of being in a room with people he loved and feeling it without filter, without the translucent barrier that had always been between the feeling and him. It was, he realized, the first time he'd been able to feel it. Actually feel it. And it was almost too much, almost, but not quite, because the almost too much quality was exactly right, exactly proportional. This was what it was supposed to be. He looked at the lake and thought, 15 months old. He thought, it's here now. He went to Diagon Alley the next morning. London was doing a version of itself he'd always privately liked best, early summer morning before the city fully committed to the day, the air still cool, the light coming in at a low angle from the east, everything slightly gold. Diagon Alley was not busy at 8 in the morning. A few shopkeepers opening up, Madame Malkin's door propped with a stone, the Owl Post Office doing its eternal early morning trade. Ollivander's shop had the sign newly painted. Harry went in and the bell made its small precise sound and Ollivander appeared from the back. He was holding something. A wand box. Old, not new, not a fresh commission. A box that had been on a shelf for some time, with slightly worn at the corners. He held it with the specific care of something valuable and set it on the counter. I made this in 1979, Ollivander said. It was never claimed. The person I made it for, it was commissioned by someone who knew someone who had seen the resonance of a child not yet born, which is unusual and requires a significant amount of trust in the person making the recommendation, but sometimes it happens. He looked at the box. The commission was placed and the wand was made and then events occurred, and the commission was never collected, and it has been on my shelf for 19 years. Harry looked at the box. Open it, Ollivander said. He did. 13 inches. Blackthorn, dark and dense, a wood associated with the specific combination of struggle overcome and the power generated by it. The core was something he didn't recognize at first, not phoenix feather, not dragon heartstring, not unicorn hair. A thin, slightly luminous thread of something. Thunderbird tail feather, Ollivander said. Very rare in Britain. The bird was brought to me by a traveler in 1978. The tail feather carries a quality specific to the bird, it senses danger in advance. It responds to instinctive magic with unusual directness. He looked at Harry. It is not a wand for careful people. Harry lifted it from the box. The warmth was immediate and specific. Not the same as the holly wand, that had been right in the way of something finally clicking into place. This was different, a recognition, bone deep, between two things that had been made for each other and had waited 19 years in separate places for the circumstances to align. He felt his magic extend through it and come back changed, not diminished, not altered, but amplified, shaped, the river through a channel that gave it direction without constraining it. He looked at Ollivander. Who commissioned it? He asked. Your mother, Ollivander said simply. Lily Potter. She came in the spring of 1979, several months before you were born. She had a gift for seeing resonances in people not yet fully formed, it was part of her specific magical talent. She said she wanted to commission a wand for her child, that she had a sense of what the child would be. I made this. He paused. She never came back to collect it. The events of 1981 made that impossible. Harry stood with the wand in his hand and looked at it. His mother had commissioned this. Had stood in this shop, 19 years ago, and told Ollivander something about the child she was carrying, and Ollivander had made this wand, and it had waited here while Harry went through a childhood and a war with 43 things placed on him that she had never sanctioned, had never known were coming. His mother had chosen this for him. He felt the wand respond to the thought, a warmth like sunlight, and had to look at the ceiling for a moment. She said one thing, Ollivander continued, quietly. When she described what she wanted. She said, something that doesn't require him to be less than he is. Harry looked at the old man for a long moment. Thank you, he said. He meant it for the report and the wand and the 31 years of careful documentation and all of it at once. Don't thank me, Ollivander said, in the same tone Fatima had used, which made Harry almost laugh. Carry it well. Harry put the wand in his jacket, not in his wand holster, in the inside pocket where the report was, close. He picked up the old box and looked at it and set it back on the counter. Can I leave this here? He asked. Ollivander looked at him. Why? Because I'll be back, Harry said. And it should be here when I come back. Ollivander picked up the box and held it with the care he gave everything. It will be, he said. He left London the next morning. Not by Portkey, not by the Ministry departure point. He took the Eurostar from St. Pancras because he liked the Eurostar, liked the tunnel under the sea, liked the way it emerged from darkness into France with the specific drama of something that made no apologies for its existence. He sat by the window with a coffee and the newspaper he didn't read and looked at the channel going past. He thought about what came next with the specific quality of thought that wasn't anxiety, the open, interested consideration of a person who has options and knows it. Geneva in the spring. Voss's office. He thought about what that would look like, which it was too early to fully imagine, but the shape of it was there, a different kind of work that required the same instincts that had kept him alive through a war but put them toward different purposes, slower purposes, the kind where the enemy was not a person but a structure. And defeating a structure required patience and documentation and the willingness to sit in rooms and listen carefully and then say the true thing clearly. He thought he could do that. He thought he'd been doing a version of it his whole life. He thought about Marrakech. Karim and the firebolt. Yusef's key in his pocket. Fatima's soup. The horned viper on the roof. The city at night from the parapet with the whole square alight below, the storytellers and the music and the sense of something very old continuing without the need for anyone's permission. He thought about his mother in Ollivander's shop in 1979. Spring. A woman who could see resonances in people not yet formed, who had stood at the counter with her unborn child somehow legible to her and had said, something that doesn't require him to be less than he is. He thought about Dumbledore, who had read the same child and had made a different calculation. Who had loved the child and had looked at the size of him and had been frightened and had, out of that fear, started building. He thought about all the people who had loved him and had let their love become something that served their own understanding of what he needed rather than actually asking. He did not hate them for it. He also did not intend to repeat the pattern. He thought about Ron in the conference room, you look like more of you. He thought about Hermione's hand in his in the gallery, taken without looking, the automatic trust of someone who had been there for every version of him and was still here for this one. He thought about Kingsley across the desk, the specific shape of his self-directed anger. He thought about Ollivander with the box. He thought about 43 bindings, one by one, placed and placed and placed, building a structure that was meant to make him manageable, and the way all 43 had dissolved the moment Voldemort's killing curse had touched him in the forest, the moment it had recognized something that couldn't be killed, not because of prophecy or fate or the magical mechanics of sacrificial protection, but because the something at the center of Harry Potter, the irreducible, unmanageable, unbindable core of him, had been there all along, doing the work under the bindings, carrying the weight. He thought, it was always there. He thought, it's still there. The train came out of the tunnel into France and the sky was clear and very blue and the countryside went past in all its summer green. He put the unread newspaper on the empty seat beside him and leaned against the window and felt the wand in his inside pocket and the report folded beside it and the key from Yusef and the Moroccan courier address he'd written on a piece of paper and kept. He was 19 years old and unbound and going south. He thought about the snake on the Marrakech roof. The conversation about temperature. Order matters less than movement. He thought, yes. He closed his eyes and felt the speed of the train and the sun on the window and let himself be in the middle of it, the motion and the light and the absolute ungoverned, unrestricted, fully present fact of himself, and for a long time after that he thought nothing at all. Just moved. That evening, in a leatherworker's shop in the Marrakech Medina, a broad-shouldered man named Youssef was locking the courtyard gate when his nephew Karim appeared at the top of the back stairs and said, in the careful tone of someone delivering news they'd already assessed as significant, "The Englishman's room. The light is on." Youssef looked up at the window. The warm gold light of it, visible through the screen. He considered this for a moment with the philosophical equanimity of a man who paid attention to things without requiring them to explain themselves. "Leave the harira on the stove," he said. Karim grinned and went back inside. Youssef finished locking the gate, looked up at the lighted window once more, and went in himself. Above the leatherworker's shop, in the narrow room that smelled of the city and old wood and something faintly like ozone after lightning, Harry Potter sat on the floor with his back against the wall and his new wand in his hand, making small lights that drifted up to the ceiling and stayed there, golden, one by one, until the room was full of them, not a lumos, not a spell from any book, just his own magic given shape, filling the space with something warm and deliberate and entirely. Finally, his